Across the world, caves have drawn explorers into the dark with the promise of discovery. Beneath the surface, though, these places reveal a different truth. One of narrow passages, rising water, and silence that never gives back what it takes. These are the stories of those who went in and never returned, and of the places that still hold them. Mosdale Caverns, Yorkshire Dales, UK, 1967. The Yorkshire Dales look peaceful from above. Rolling hills, green fields, and quiet moorland streams. But beneath the surface lies a maze of limestone tunnels carved by water over millennia. One of those tunnels, hidden near the remote village of Grassington, would become the site of the deadliest caving disaster in British history. It was Saturday, June 24th, 1967. 10 members of the University of Leeds Speleological Association set out toward Mosdale Caverns, a well-known but feared system near Coniston Moor. They were young, fit, and among the most capable cavers in the region. Their goal that day was to explore beyond the known sections, pushing through tight, water-filled passages called the Marathon Crawls. The underground stream that shaped Mossdale flowed steadily at the time, just enough to make movement slow and uncomfortable, but not dangerous. They split into 2 groups. The first, led by Dave Adamson, consisted of 6 men, Adamson himself, along with Jeff Boireau, John Ogden, Colin Vickers, Bill Frakes, and Mike Ryan. The second group of 4 included 2 women, Morag Forbes and June Bailey, who would eventually leave the system earlier than the others. The first team moved deeper, crawling through low, muddy tunnels that forced them to lie flat in cold water, pushing packs ahead of them inch by inch. Outside, on the moor above, clouds were gathering. By mid-afternoon, a heavy summer storm swept across Yorkshire. Rain lashed the hills, and the small stream that vanished into Mossdale's entrance began to swell. The cave's natural drainage system was narrow, and as the rainfall increased, it quickly turned into a funnel. Inside, the men had no idea how fast the conditions were changing. They were nearly a mile underground, beyond the main chambers, in a section known for its claustrophobic squeezes. There were no radios, no way to monitor weather from below. The second team, having turned back earlier, noticed the water levels rising as they made their way to the surface. By the time they reached the entrance, the situation had turned critical. Morag Forbes was among the first to realise the danger. The entrance passage, a streamway that normally could be crawled through, had become a violent flow of brown, debris-filled water. She shouted into the darkness, calling the names of the men still inside. There was no response. The roar of the flood drowned out everything else. In minutes, the entrance was completely submerged. Morag ran several miles across the moor in the storm to raise the alarm. By nightfall, local police, cave rescue teams, and volunteers from nearby clubs had arrived. The rain, however, did not stop. They tried to divert the stream away from the cave by digging channels, using spades and bare hands under pouring rain, but the effort made little difference. The water simply poured down from the hills faster than they could move it. For the rescuers, the situation was a nightmare. They knew exactly where the trapped cavers were likely to be, deep beyond the Marathon Crawls, but reaching them required passing through flooded tunnels barely wide enough for a human body. No equipment existed that could keep them alive in such conditions. The Yorkshire Underground Rescue Organisation concluded that any immediate attempt would only create more casualties. They had to wait. When morning came, the rain eased. The team re-entered Mossdale. The water had dropped, but the air was thick, humid, and cold. As they crawled through the passageways, they found traces of the team. Abandoned packs, lights, and ropes. About 1,000 feet into the marathon section, they discovered the bodies of 5 men lying in a low, flooded crawl. A 6th was found later in another section. None had made it close to safety. The position of the bodies suggested they had been caught suddenly as the water rose, leaving no time to turn back. The coroner later determined that all 6 died by drowning within minutes of the flood entering the cave. It had been one of those freak combinations of timing and weather that no one could have predicted. The recovery operation that followed was long and controversial. The passages were so tight that bringing the bodies out was judged too dangerous. Several rescuers nearly became trapped themselves in the same flooded crawls. Eventually, after days of deliberation, it was decided to seal the system to prevent further deaths. The surviving members of the expedition and the families of the deceased were devastated, but accepted the decision. Concrete slabs were placed over the main entrance, effectively entombing the bodies inside. For years, this decision haunted the British caving community. Some felt it was necessary, a mark of respect and safety, while others believed the men deserved to be recovered and buried above ground. In 1971, a small team of cavers, with official permission, entered the system one last time to move the remains to a drier chamber deeper in the cave. There they built a cairn of stones and placed a plaque with the names of the 6 who perished. Above ground on the windswept moor, another memorial was erected. It still stands today, a simple stone cairn with a brass plate reading, "To those who died in Mosdale Caverns, the 24th of June 1967. It overlooks the silent sinkhole where the cave begins, a place that now appears peaceful, almost indifferent to the tragedy below. The disaster prompted new guidelines in British caving. Weather monitoring before expeditions became standard practice. Clubs began keeping detailed logs of rainfall and river levels in the dales, and communication between surface teams and underground explorers improved. Many of these safety protocols trace their roots to what happened at Mossdale. Even with all the improvements, Mosdale Caverns has never lost its reputation. It remains closed by the National Park authorities, though over the decades, some experienced cavers have ventured back inside unofficially, mapping routes and documenting the system. They speak of a cave that feels alive, breathing with the water table, beautiful yet treacherous. Those who know it best say that Mossdale never forgives mistakes. In later geological studies, experts confirmed what the 1967 rescue teams had already suspected. The area above the cave is covered with drainage channels called grips, dug decades earlier to help moorland farming. During intense rain, these grips funneled water directly toward Mossdale Beck, overwhelming its natural flow and sending a wall of water underground. The cavers, deep inside the tightest parts of the system, were in the worst possible place at the worst possible moment. Decades later, people who were there still remember that weekend. Survivors described it as a mix of disbelief and helplessness, the sense that the cave had swallowed their friends whole. For the wider community, it changed how they looked at the dales themselves. The same limestone that had attracted explorers for its beauty and challenge also hid lethal unpredictability. The names of the 6, Adamson, Boireau, Ogden, Vickers, Frakes and Ryan, became part of British caving history. Their story is retold in clubs across the country as a lesson in respect for water, rock and timing. Mossdale is now both a tomb and a teacher, a reminder that even in the age of skill and knowledge, nature holds the final word. Peak Cavern, Moss Chamber, Derbyshire, UK, 1959. In the heart of the Peak District, beneath the cliffs near Castleton, lies one of Britain's largest cave systems, a place locals once called the Devil's Arse for the strange noises that echoed from its entrance. Known officially as Peak Cavern, it had always drawn explorers, from miners and scientists to curious students. But in March 1959, it became the stage for a tragedy that showed just how narrow the line can be between exploration and disaster. It began on a Saturday morning, March 22nd. A 20-year-old Oxford undergraduate named Neil Moss joined a small team of cavers, most of them members of the university's Speleological Society. They had come to explore a recently opened section of Peak Cavern, a vertical shaft newly found off a narrow crawlway deep inside the system. The shaft dropped about 22 metres, tight and twisting, ending in a constricted vertical passage that no one had yet reached the bottom of. It would later be named Moss Chamber. Neil was the second man to descend that day. The first, a more experienced caver named Bob Leakey, had made it partway down but stopped when the air grew heavy. Leakey sensed the build-up of bad air, possibly carbon dioxide, and decided to climb back up. Moss, younger and eager to make his mark, volunteered to try again. He attached a rope ladder to the anchor and began the descent. At first, all seemed normal. Voices echoed faintly up the shaft as he moved downward, his headlamp beam bouncing off damp limestone walls. But as he approached the lower section, the passage narrowed sharply, tapering to less than a foot wide. The walls pressed on his chest. His breathing quickened. Then he slipped a few inches deeper, just enough for his chest and shoulders to become wedged. The team above waited for his signal. Minutes passed. Then came his voice, strained but calm. "I'm stuck." They tried to pull him up, but the angle made it impossible. Every tug only pressed his body tighter into the fissure. He couldn't move his arms freely, and the confined space left almost no room for tools or gear. As hours passed, the situation worsened. The air in the shaft grew foul. The rescuers could feel it too, a sense of dizziness, shallow breathing, the telltale signs of carbon dioxide accumulation. Underground streams nearby constantly released CO2 from decomposing organic matter. In a deep, narrow vertical crack like this, the gas simply settled, forming a pocket of oxygen-poor air. Word spread quickly across Derbyshire. Within hours, rescue teams from around the region converged on the site. By nightfall, nearly 100 volunteers were on scene. Engineers brought in generators, pumps, and compressed air lines to improve ventilation. But Peak Cavern's narrow, twisting approach routes made transporting equipment slow and exhausting. Every piece had to be carried by hand through crawls and climbs. Meanwhile, Neil was still alive, barely. Rescuers took turns speaking to him through the narrow passage, trying to keep him conscious. He remained calm and polite, even as exhaustion and gas took hold. At one point, he asked that his parents not be told what was happening until he was safely out. Above ground, his father, Professor F.E. Moss, was already waiting anxiously. By the next morning, efforts intensified. Small teams rotated through the shaft, chiseling at the rock around Neil, widening it millimetre by millimetre. The rescuers were forced to crawl headfirst into the fissure, suspended by ropes, often feeling their own lungs tighten from the bad air. They worked in the dark, lying almost on top of him, trying to pass food and oxygen through the gap. But his position, vertical, head angled upward, shoulders locked, made it almost impossible to free him. At one point, they succeeded in lifting him a few inches, only for him to slip back again. Each attempt risked dislodging debris that could fall on him or collapse the narrow shaft. By the second night, nearly 30 hours after the accident, the rescue had turned desperate. An RAF doctor advised that Neil was likely already suffering from oxygen deprivation and carbon dioxide poisoning. The air compressors brought in were barely making a difference. Rescuers could no longer stay inside the chamber for more than a few minutes at a time. Some collapsed from exhaustion or dizziness. Sometime early on Monday morning, Neil stopped responding. Rescuers who managed to reach him could no longer detect breathing or movement. The silence that followed was unbearable. They knew what it meant, but no one wanted to say it aloud. When officials finally confirmed his death, the debate began: how to bring him out. The fissure was so tight that extracting the body would have required breaking apart the surrounding rock, a process that would risk the lives of anyone attempting it. The coroner and the rescue leaders met with Neil's father, who made the most difficult decision of all. He asked that his son's body be left where it was, saying he did not wish any more lives to be endangered. A small memorial plaque was later placed at the entrance of the chamber, and the narrow passage was sealed with concrete and rock, becoming his tomb. The place remains closed off, known forever as Moss Chamber. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the caving world. Until then, few had considered how deadly confined space gases could be underground. The build-up of carbon dioxide, while known to miners, was less understood by recreational cavers. Moss's death changed that. Rescue organisations began carrying portable air monitors and introduced strict ventilation procedures for deep shafts. Engineers studied the cave's geology and found that the fissure acted as a natural sink for heavy gas, collecting CO2 from decomposing organic layers above. Even if Neil hadn't become trapped, staying in that chamber much longer might have been fatal anyway. For those involved, the experience left lasting scars. Many rescuers later said they could still remember the sound of his voice echoing faintly up the shaft. Polite, calm, and determined, even as time slipped away. They worked for 2 full days, refusing to give up until there was no doubt. Today, Peak Cavern remains one of the most visited caves in Britain. Its vast entrance open to tourists and school trips. But few who visit realise that deep beyond the show passages, down a narrow sealed fissure, lies the final resting place of the young man whose curiosity took him one step too far. For the caving community, the name Moss Chamber is spoken quietly. It reminds them that courage underground must always bow to physics, to the weight of rock, the absence of air, and the limits of the human body. Langstroth Pot, Yorkshire Dales, UK, 1976. The Yorkshire Dales are dotted with small openings that lead into the earth, some little more than cracks, others gateways to miles of underground rivers. Langstroth in Upper Wharfdale looks peaceful from above, a quiet valley of stone walls and grazing sheep, but beneath it lies a web of flooded tunnels, linking sinkholes and sumps where air and water meet in fragile balance. In the spring of 1976, that balance was broken, and 3 skilled cavers never returned. Langstroth Pot had always been considered challenging but manageable. It was not a deep system by British standards, around 100 feet overall. Yet it involved negotiating several tight water-filled sections, or sumps, where the caver had to briefly dive underwater to reach the next chamber. These short, free dives were a common practice at the time, done without air tanks, relying instead on a single lungful of air and careful timing. The passages were narrow and silted, but experienced cavers had passed them many times before. On May 29, 1976, a small group from the Leeds University Speleological Association entered Langstroth Pot for what they expected to be a routine trip. Their plan was to explore the lower series of the system, passing through a few sumps to reach a chamber known as the Air Bell. Among them were 3 young men in their 20s, skilled, confident, and familiar with the Dales. The conditions that day were typical for early summer: damp, cool, and steady. There had been no recent heavy rain, so flooding was not considered a concern. The team descended smoothly through the entrance pitch, crawling through low tunnels and dropping down to the stream passage that led to the first sump. They took turns diving through, each disappearing under the still dark water and re-emerging seconds later in the air pocket on the far side. What none of them knew was that the air bell, the small dome of trapped air that gave them space to breathe between sumps, had been quietly turning deadly. Over time, carbon dioxide had been accumulating there. Underground air pockets can become stagnant when isolated from surface ventilation, and the heavier CO2 displaces oxygen, creating what rescuers later called bad air. It's odourless, silent, and invisible. In small concentrations, it causes confusion and dizziness. In higher levels, it suffocates within minutes. The first of the 3 divers entered the sump and surfaced into the air bell, expecting the familiar moment of calm before pushing on. Instead, he likely encountered a mix of stale gas and near-zero oxygen. The effects are rapid: increased heart rate, gasping, then blackout. The others, unaware of what had happened, followed close behind. When the rest of the group waiting behind the sump heard no response, they became alarmed. Calls into the tunnel went unanswered. After several minutes, one of them tried to free dive through to check, but the passage was narrow, visibility poor, and panic rising. They surfaced back in the entry chamber, realizing that something had gone terribly wrong. Word was sent to the surface, and by evening, rescue teams from the Upper Wharfdale Fell Rescue Association had arrived. They were among the most experienced caving rescuers in Britain, having responded to dozens of incidents across the Dales. But the situation at Langstroth was different. There was no collapse to dig through, no flood to drain, only a flooded sump with unknown air conditions beyond. Divers were brought in, equipped with breathing apparatus. The passage was so tight that most could barely squeeze through even without tanks. The rescuers made repeated attempts, each one lasting only minutes due to the risk of disorientation or entrapment. Finally, one diver managed to pass the sump completely and enter the chamber beyond. What he found confirmed their fears. All 3 men had perished, their lights still burning dimly in the dark water. The recovery took several hours and required the help of multiple dive teams working in rotation. Even with modern equipment, the poor air quality forced divers to retreat frequently. Some described feeling their own breathing grow heavy and slow, a sign that the carbon dioxide was seeping even into their breathing spaces. When the bodies were finally brought to the surface, the scale of the tragedy struck the caving community deeply. These were not reckless novices. They had done everything by the book. The weather had been good, their route familiar. What killed them was something unseen, a hidden chemical trap that even the most careful explorers couldn't have predicted. At the inquest that followed, experts explained the science behind what had happened. The air bell, once a safe resting pocket, had become a sealed chamber where exhaled air and natural CO2 buildup displaced oxygen over time. Without ventilation or water flow to mix the gases, the concentration rose to lethal levels. The first diver to enter would have felt the effects within seconds. As he lost consciousness, his body blocked part of the sump, making rescue even harder for those who followed. The coroner ruled the deaths accidental, caused by asphyxiation from oxygen depletion. But the case did not end there. Langstroth Pot quickly became a point of discussion at caving conferences across the UK. Rescuers, geologists and club leaders began re-evaluating how they assessed risk in short water-filled sections. Until then, freediving through sumps was common practice, viewed as a quick, efficient way to cross flooded passages without the heavy gear of cave diving. After Langstroth, that culture began to change. One of the most important lessons was about air testing. Before 1976, few teams carried equipment to check oxygen or CO2 levels in enclosed chambers. The tragedy at Langstroth showed that dangerous gases weren't confined to deep mines or sealed shafts. They could develop anywhere underground where airflow was limited. Within a year, rescue teams began using portable chemical oxygen indicators and ventilation hoses during operations. The event also changed how the caving community documented their routes. Detailed maps began including notes on air bells, sumps and stagnant sections, along with dates of last exploration and any known gas issues. Over time, this built a nationwide record that continues to inform safety today. Langstroth Pot itself was later revisited by specialised dive teams. They confirmed that the section beyond the fatal sump remained unstable, with recurring CO2 buildup. The site was left unaltered out of respect, though some advanced divers have since passed through with breathing equipment. To this day, local cavers speak of Langstroth with a kind of quiet caution. The tragedy reminded everyone that the dangers underground are not always visible. Sometimes it's not the rock that moves or the water that rises, but the very air that turns against you. The 3 men lost in Langstroth Pot were remembered at memorials across Yorkshire. Their story joined a growing list of hard-earned lessons written in the Dale's limestone. Each cave, each sump, each air bell taught something new about how humans push boundaries and how nature answers back. Marble Arch Caves, Lower Cradle Hole, N Island, 1995. The Marble Arch Caves are among Northern Ireland's most famous natural wonders. A world of flowing rivers, limestone chambers, and echoing darkness beneath County Fermanagh. The same underground rivers that carved these caverns make them unpredictable. When rain falls on the hills above, the water moves quickly, filling narrow tunnels and turning calm streamways into traps. In 1995, that hidden power claimed 3 young lives in what became one of the most haunting caving accidents in Ireland's history. It was March 15th, 1995. 10 students from University College Dublin's Caving Club set out for a routine exploration trip. The group included experienced leaders, several new members, and 2 visiting students. They planned to enter the system through a sinkhole known as Lower Cradle Hole, which connects into the larger network of the Marble Arch Caves. Their route would take them along an active stream passage leading toward the Grand Gallery, one of the most impressive underground chambers in Ireland. The morning started clear but cold. Snowmelt from the surrounding Quilcar Mountains had already raised the local rivers, but inside the caves the water level seemed manageable. The students began their descent around mid-morning, dressed in wetsuits and carrying helmets, lamps and packs with basic safety gear. For university clubs in the 1990s, this was standard procedure. Marble Arch was well known and widely explored. The group divided naturally into smaller sections as they moved through the cave, each following the same narrow streamway. What they didn't know was that the weather outside was changing fast. Rain was falling steadily over the hills, feeding into the underground drainage system that ran directly through the passages they were exploring. Underground rivers respond to rainfall almost instantly, far faster than those on the surface. A few millimetres of rain can raise water levels by a metre in minutes. By early afternoon, the team had reached a section known as the Duck, a low water-filled tunnel that connects 2 larger chambers. Under normal conditions, this passage has a small airspace, enough for a person to lie flat in the water and breathe while pushing forward. It's tight, cold and claustrophobic, but manageable. The lead group of 3 entered first, followed by the rest a few metres behind. Halfway through the Duck, the water began to rise. It started as a slow swell, a ripple at first, then a surge. The airspace shrank rapidly. The 3 in front tried to move faster, but the tunnel offered no room to turn around. Behind them, the others sensed something was wrong when they heard muffled shouts and splashing that didn't sound right. Within seconds, the narrow passage filled completely. The students behind scrambled for higher ground, retreating to a small ledge above the streamway. They called into the flooded tunnel, but there was no response. Panic spread. Some tried to dive through the duck, hoping to reach their friends, but the current was too strong. The water was ice cold and visibility dropped to zero. One student nearly became trapped himself before retreating. Above ground, no one yet knew what had happened. It would take hours before rescue teams arrived, alerted by those who managed to climb back to the surface through side passages. By the time the first rescue units from the Irish Cave Rescue Organisation reached the scene, night had fallen. Heavy rain continued to fall over the Cuilcagh Plateau, feeding the same underground river that had flooded the passage. The rescue operation was one of the most difficult ever attempted in Ireland. The passages leading to the duck were narrow, twisting and completely underwater. Divers were brought in from the Royal Navy and from caving rescue teams across Britain. Pumping equipment was carried through the forest, across fields and down into the sinkhole. Everything had to be done by hand, as there was no road access to the site. For the rescuers, time moved slowly. Each attempt to enter the flooded section was limited by air supply, temperature, and the sheer difficulty of navigating through submerged rock. On the first dives, they found nothing but floating debris and dislodged gear. The flood currents were still too powerful. It wasn't until the following day, when water levels began to drop, that divers could safely re-enter the duck passage. In the chamber beyond, they found the bodies of the 3 missing students, 2 men and 1 woman. The position of their equipment showed they had tried to push forward rather than turn back, likely believing they were only seconds from safety. The chamber on the other side, the Grand Gallery, was just meters away, an open space they never reached. The remaining 7 students were treated for hypothermia and shock. Many of them stayed at the scene for days, assisting with surface operations and giving statements. The university community was devastated. For many of the students, it was their first serious caving trip outside of practice environments, and none had imagined how quickly conditions could change underground. An inquest held later that year provided a clearer picture of the disaster. Expert witnesses from the British Cave Rescue Council explained how the topography of the Marble Arch system made it especially sensitive to rainfall. The sinkholes and swallow holes on the surface act as direct funnels for runoff water, feeding into the same stream passages that cavers use as routes. The section known as the Duck had always been recognised as a potential risk area, but there were no formal warning systems or real-time water monitors in 1995. The coroner's report described how the 3 victims likely encountered a sudden loss of breathable air, known in caving terms as a low airspace entrapment. Once the gap between water and ceiling shrinks below a few inches, oxygen levels drop quickly and exhaled carbon dioxide accumulates, creating a suffocating layer. The rising current and the silt stirred up from the floor made visibility almost zero, disorienting anyone inside. Following the inquest, the Irish Cave Rescue Organisation and university caving clubs across the UK and Ireland changed their safety procedures. Real-time weather checks, surface watchers, and strict no-go rules for active stream caves during or after rainfall became standard. The Marble Arch caves were closed for several months for review. When they reopened, warning signs were installed at all known entrances. The disaster also led to the creation of new coordination systems between the caving community and local emergency services. In the 1990s, mobile communication underground was almost impossible, but new radio relays and call-out systems were developed afterward. Many of these protocols still guide rescue operations today. The memory of the 3 students remains tied to the beauty and danger of Marble Arch. Guides who now lead tourists through the safe show cave sections rarely mention the tragedy, but for cavers, it's a story that never faded. The site of Lower Cradle Hole is no longer used for recreational trips, and the Duck Passage remains a place of silence, where a few inches of rising water turned a day of exploration into one of Ireland's darkest underground events. Ermenek mine flood, Karaman, Turkey, 2014. In the mountains of southern Turkey, near the small town of Ermenek, coal mining had long been a way of life. Generations of families worked the seams that ran beneath the hills, digging deep into narrow shafts that stretched hundreds of meters underground. It was hard, dangerous work, but in places like Karaman province it was often the only work there was. On the morning of October 28, 2014, 34 miners descended into the privately operated Hasekala mine. They began their shift as usual, 350 metres below the surface. The mine had been operating for years, known for its labyrinth of tunnels and galleries carved through soft lignite coal. Above ground, the weather was calm. Grey skies, light wind, nothing unusual. Underground, though, something was changing, and just after noon, workers heard a low rumble from deeper in the mine. Within seconds, water began rushing down the main gallery. It came fast, black, cold, and unstoppable. The miners had struck an abandoned flooded shaft from a neighbouring mine. When the thin barrier separating the two cavities gave way, tens of thousands of cubic metres of water surged through. The torrent swept through the tunnels, flooding everything in its path. 18 men working in the lower sections were trapped almost instantly. Those closer to the entrance managed to climb ladders and crawl ways, scrambling toward higher ground as alarms sounded. Survivors later said the water rose faster than anyone could run. Some were waist deep within seconds. By the time they reached the nearest shaft, the lower levels were completely submerged. At 12:15 p.m, the surface crew raised the alarm. Word reached local authorities within minutes. Soon, trucks, ambulances and rescue units from across the region were on their way to the remote site. The governor of Cavern ordered all available emergency teams to respond. Within hours, more than 400 personnel were gathered outside the mine, setting up floodlights, tents and command posts. For those first hours, no one knew how deep the water was or whether anyone was still alive below. Pumps were brought in from nearby mines to start draining the flooded tunnels. The first measurements showed the water level was rising, not falling. The pumps couldn't keep up, there was simply too much volume. The mine's ventilation shafts had turned into fountains, gushing brown water into the open air. Inside the control tent, maps of the mine were spread out on tables. The diagrams showed the network of galleries, some dating back to earlier operations. It soon became clear that the barrier between the working tunnel and the abandoned one had been dangerously thin, only a few meters of coal and rock. The old shaft had been flooded for years, filled with stagnant water and toxic gases. No one knew exactly how much water it held or how stable the dividing wall was. As the hours passed, families of the trapped men began arriving at the site. They gathered behind the police line holding photos and cell phones, waiting for updates that never came. For many, it was all too familiar. Only 5 months earlier, in May 2014, Turkey had suffered the Soma mining disaster, where 301 workers died after an explosion and fire. Now, another mine was underwater, and the country was once again watching in disbelief. By the second day, the rescue operation had become a national emergency. The Turkish Disaster and Emergency Management Authority coordinated efforts alongside military engineers and specialised mine rescue units. Teams worked around the clock, using heavy equipment to drill new boreholes into the flooded galleries. They hoped to reach air pockets where survivors might have found refuge. But every new hole brought the same result: water, mud, and the smell of decay. The underground temperature hovered near freezing. Even if any of the men had survived the initial flood, hypothermia or lack of oxygen would have overtaken them quickly. Still, the rescuers refused to give up. For days, the whine of pumps and generators filled the valley. Each hour, workers removed hundreds of litres of water, only to see more seep back in through cracks. The Prime Minister visited the site on the third day, promising a full investigation. He met with the families, who demanded to know why their sons and husbands had been sent into a mine with known risks. Reports began to surface that safety violations had been ignored. Former workers spoke to journalists describing flooded sections and poor maintenance. One said he had warned supervisors about water seeping into the lower levels weeks before the disaster. After 10 days, rescue hopes had faded, but the work continued. The pumps had by then removed millions of litres of water, revealing collapsed tunnels filled with mud and debris. Divers and engineers took turns entering the lower shafts in short, dangerous missions. Visibility was nearly zero. They worked by touch, feeling along cables and walls, searching for any sign of the missing men. On November 18th, 21 days after the flood, the first bodies were found. They were discovered near a section known as Gallery 18, 350 metres from the surface. The water there was thick with silt, making recovery slow and difficult. Over the following weeks, more remains were found in clusters, trapped behind machinery or collapsed supports. Each discovery brought brief hope to families desperate for closure. But none of the 18 had survived. The final recovery came on December 4th, 38 days after the flood began. The operation ended with all 18 bodies accounted for. The mine, once a place of work and livelihood, was sealed shortly after. When the official investigation report was released, it confirmed what many already suspected. The disaster had been avoidable. The company operating the mine had failed to map older workings in the area, ignored warnings about water ingress, and lacked proper emergency procedures. The wall that gave way had been left unreinforced. Inspections that might have revealed the danger were never carried out. The report also revealed that the emergency pumps used during the first critical hours were far below capacity. They were designed for small water seepage, not for the massive inflow from a flooded shaft. Delays in bringing in industrial pumps from other provinces cost valuable time. In 2019, 5 years later, Turkish courts convicted several mine officials of negligence, including the mine's owner and senior engineers. Families of the victims attended the trial, holding framed photographs and clippings from the days of the disaster. For them, the case was not only about justice but about acknowledgement, proof that their loved ones hadn't died simply by chance. At the site today, the mine entrance remains closed. The hillside is quiet again, covered in scrub and rusted machinery. Locals still pass by the road leading up to it, where a small memorial plaque bears the names of the 18 who never returned. Their story became part of a national reckoning over mining safety in Turkey, a stark reminder of how, even underground, water remains one of nature's most unstoppable forces. Gouffre de la Pierre Saint-Martin, France, Spain, 1952. In the summer of 1952, the limestone mountains straddling the border between France and Spain became the centre of one of the most daring and tragic cave explorations in European history. The Gouffre de la Pierre Saint-Martin, a vast sinkhole opening into one of the deepest cave systems on Earth, had long drawn explorers searching for the limits of the underground world. At the time, it was a frontier of both geography and human endurance. No one had ever attempted to descend so far into the Earth. The expedition that year was led by Norbert Castoret and Pierre Saint-Martin, pioneers of modern speleology. Their goal was to map the unexplored chambers and measure the depth of the cave system, believed to exceed 1,000 metres. To do this, they assembled a team of France's most skilled cavers, supported by engineers and scientists. Among them was Marcel Lubens, a 29-year-old electrical engineer from Toulouse, known for his technical skill and calm precision underground. At the time, caving was entering a new era. The Gouffre de la Pierre Saint-Martin was not just a hole in the ground, it was a vertical world. The main shaft alone dropped more than 300 metres in a single descent, the equivalent of the height of the Eiffel Tower. No rope or ladder could span that distance safely. Instead, the team designed a special winch and steel cable system to lower explorers in stages using a powered drum, a system inspired by mining equipment. It was an ambitious setup for 1952, and it made the expedition feel closer to a scientific mission than an adventure. On August 13, 1952, the team gathered at the mouth of the great shaft. Mist drifted through the trees, and the sound of rushing water echoed from deep below. Marcel Lubens volunteered to descend first to help set up the lower station and inspect the walls for stability. He strapped himself into the harness, a simple wooden seat attached to the cable, and gave the signal to begin. The motor hummed, and he slowly disappeared into the darkness. At first, everything went as planned. The voice on the radio confirmed his progress. He called out depths as he passed each checkpoint, 50 metres, 100, 200. Then, near the lower platform to get about 250 metres down, something went wrong. Witnesses heard a metallic snap echo up the shaft. The winch wire had failed. In seconds, the line went slack and the seat dropped into the darkness. The sound of impact came a few moments later, followed by silence. The team froze. It was unthinkable. The equipment had been tested repeatedly, the cable rated to hold far more than a single man's weight. Yet something had failed. Rescuers were mobilised instantly. Within minutes, experienced cavers began descending the shaft on auxiliary lines, carrying first aid kits and stretchers. When they reached the bottom, they found Lubens alive but gravely injured. The fall, roughly 15 metres from where the cable failed, had broken his back and caused massive internal injuries. Despite the shock, he was conscious, even speaking to his rescuers. He told them not to risk their own safety for him, insisting they proceed carefully. His calmness impressed everyone present. The rescuers stabilised him as best they could in the confined space. But moving him upward was nearly impossible. The vertical shaft was narrow, slick with condensation, and full of jagged outcroppings. The main lift system was useless. The broken wire had tangled the mechanism. The only alternative was to haul him manually, using ropes and pulleys inch by inch. For more than 20 hours, rescuers worked in the freezing darkness. Oxygen levels were low, and condensation made every grip treacherous. They managed to move him only a short distance before fatigue and lack of light forced them to stop. Lubens remained lucid for much of the time, encouraging the others to rest, even as his condition worsened. As the hours passed, it became clear he would not survive. He died the next day, deep inside the cave he had helped explore. The team, exhausted and devastated, faced a grim decision. Hauling a lifeless body up the 300-metre shaft in those conditions would have been nearly impossible. The risk to rescuers was too great. They decided to bury him where he'd fallen, marking the spot with a small plaque and sealing the chamber. Word of the accident spread quickly across Europe. Newspapers described it as both a tragedy and a turning point for the science of caving. The Gouffre de la Pierre Saint-Martin, already famous among speleologists, now became a symbol of both ambition and loss. In the weeks that followed, engineers analysed the failure. The steel cable had frayed internally from repeated tension and friction against the winch drum, weakening it unnoticed. The system had lacked a secondary safety line, standard practice in industrial operations but rarely used in exploration at the time. The inquest concluded that the failure was mechanical, not human error, though it revealed how experimental the equipment truly was. The French Federation of Speleology took the findings seriously. New guidelines were drafted for vertical caving operations. All lift systems would henceforth require redundant safety cables, rated harnesses, and formal testing before use. The lessons from Lubens' death reshaped how explorers approached deep vertical shafts around the world. A year later, in 1953, the cave was revisited by another French team. They reached even greater depths, confirming the Gouffre de la Pierre Saint-Martin as one of the deepest known cave systems in the world. During that expedition, they located the site of Lubens' burial and held a brief ceremony. His remains were later retrieved in 1954 and brought to the surface after 2 years underground. He was buried in Toulouse, his hometown, with full honours from the caving community. The system itself would go on to become one of the most studied caves in Europe. Scientists mapped over 50 kilometres of interconnected passages, rivers, and shafts, including sections extending into Spain. It remains a proving ground for advanced cave exploration, with its immense depth and complex hydrology attracting teams from across the world. But for all its discoveries, the cave's story always returns to that moment in 1952. The failure of a cable, the bravery of a young engineer, and the limits of human control in the depths of the earth. Gouffre Berger flood, Vercors, France, 1996. In the limestone mountains of the Vercors Massif in southeastern France lies one of the most legendary caves on Earth, the Gouffre Berger. For decades, it was known as the first cave in the world to exceed a depth of 1,000 metres, a symbol of exploration, endurance, and danger. Generations of cavers had descended into its black chambers, facing waterfalls, rope drops, and long, flooded passages. But in August 1996, a sudden storm turned the Berger into a trap. Within hours, the deepest cave in France became a flooded labyrinth, cutting off and claiming lives hundreds of metres below ground. That summer had been unusually warm, with heavy rainstorms rolling across the Alps. On August the 24th, a group of experienced cavers from several French clubs, along with visiting members from Belgium and Italy, entered the Gouffre Berger for what was meant to be a multi-day trip. Their plan was ambitious: to reach the bottom at 1,120 metres, rest overnight in one of the underground camps, and climb back out the next day. The entrance lay high on the Vercors Plateau at an altitude of nearly 1,500 metres. From there, the descent involved a series of vertical shafts connected by narrow meanders and stream passages. At that time of year, the cave was considered stable, though everyone knew its temperament could change quickly if rain hit the plateau. The Gouffre Berger is a collecting cave, a system that channels rainfall from surface sinkholes into a single subterranean river. When storms come, the water has nowhere to go but down. The team of 12 split into smaller groups as they descended. The upper sections were a mix of rope pitches and small waterfalls, wet but manageable. Deeper down, the cave opened into vast galleries with underground pools and cascades that required wading or swimming. Around midday, several members reached the camp at 700 metres, known as the Salle des Tres, where they planned to rest before pushing farther. Above ground, a storm was building. Weather data later showed that more than 40 millimetres of rain fell across the plateau within a few hours. The porous limestone soaked up the water like a sponge, then released it into the cave's active streamway. Underground, the first signs appeared as a distant roar, a low rumble that seasoned cavers recognised immediately. By mid-afternoon, water began rising through the lower galleries. Passages that had been ankle-deep were now waist-deep and climbing. The air grew colder as spray filled the tunnels. Communication between the different groups became almost impossible. Those near the bottom, still exploring the sump area, realised the route back was closing fast. One of the cavers, positioned near a section called the Puits Aldo, tried to radio a warning to the surface camp, but the signal never reached. Within minutes, the water levels surged. The powerful current tore through narrow bends, filling the shafts like chimneys. The Gouffre Berger had turned into a waterfall from top to bottom. At 700 metres, one team decided to move upward immediately. They fought their way against the current, hauling packs and ropes up vertical pitches now streaming like rivers. Each climb took twice as long as normal. Visibility dropped to near zero. Lights flickered and batteries failed as water pounded the helmets. In some places, the passageways were completely submerged, forcing them to hold their breath and swim through flooded ducts. Short, air-starved tunnels that now looked like black, boiling drains. The first fatality occurred when one caver, swept off a ledge near a narrow chute, was pulled into a flooded section and disappeared. The others tried to reach him but were forced back by the current. They regrouped higher up, exhausted, bruised and shivering. In total darkness, they could only listen to the constant roar of the water and the cracking sound of falling rocks. Above them, surface rescuers were already mobilising. When the team failed to make radio contact at the expected time, members of the Vercors Speleological Rescue Service began preparing. Rain continued to fall across the plateau, making helicopter transport impossible. Rescuers reached the cave entrance by 10 p.m, where water was already spilling out in torrents. They knew conditions inside would be catastrophic. For those trapped underground, survival meant finding higher ground. The teams climbed into side chambers, small pockets of air and rock above the flood level. They huddled together to stay warm, waiting for the noise of rushing water to fade, the sign that levels were dropping. It would take nearly 12 hours for the flood to begin receding. By dawn, the storm had passed. The first rescue teams entered the Gouffre Berger as soon as it was safe enough. They descended cautiously, securing new ropes and checking for collapsed sections. The deeper they went, the more debris they found, logs, stones and mud carried down by the flood. Around 500 metres, they met the first survivors climbing up. The men were exhausted, pale and trembling, but alive. They reported that others were still below. Rescue efforts continued non-stop for the next 48 hours. In all, more than 100 rescuers took part, including cave divers, firefighters, and doctors trained in hypothermia treatment. Makeshift medical stations were set up inside the cave at several points. Communication lines were installed to relay updates to the surface. It wasn't until the second day that divers reached the lower chambers and confirmed the fate of the missing. The bodies of 2 cavers, both French, were found near the 900-metre level, where the passage had completely flooded. Their lights and gear indicated they had tried to climb back up but were trapped by the rising torrent. The survivors were brought out in stages, many suffering from exhaustion and exposure. Some had been underground for nearly 3 days. When they finally emerged into the daylight, the world's press was waiting. Nothing. Drawn by the scale of the operation and the reputation of the cave itself. The official investigation later confirmed the cause of the tragedy. A sudden storm had dropped an exceptional volume of water onto the plateau, producing a flash flood that overwhelmed the system. The Gouffre Berger's vertical nature amplified the danger. Once the lower levels filled, the water pressure forced air upward, creating violent drafts and suction currents that made escape nearly impossible. Experts noted that the storm warning system in place at the time did not extend to caving activities. The Surface Weather Station had issued alerts, but communication between local authorities and caving groups was informal. After the accident, the French Federation of Speleology established new protocols requiring surface weather checks and dedicated surface watch teams for all deep expeditions. For cavers worldwide, the 1996 Berger flood became a case study in how weather, distant, unseen, and often underestimated, could transform a cave from a place of exploration into a deadly trap. In later years, improved mapping showed how the water paths of the Vercors Plateau interconnect across kilometres of underground channels. Rain falling far away could reach the Gouffre Berger in under 2 hours. Every summer since, rescue teams return to the site for training. They rappel through the same shafts, past the same landmarks, the Puits Gontard, the Camp of 700, the Grand Canyon, reminders of the expedition that ended beneath a sudden storm. The flood of 1996 changed how the caving world reads the weather and how it listens to the distant rumble of water deep below the mountain. Easegill Caverns, Lancashire, Cumbria, UK. 1988. On the slopes of Lech Fell between the counties of Lancashire and Cumbria lies Easegill Caverns, the longest cave system in Britain, a labyrinth stretching more than 60 kilometres beneath the hills. For decades, it has been a testing ground for the best cavers in the country, a place where generations learned vertical work, rigging and underground navigation. But in January 1988, that same network of passages became the site of a tragedy that would change how caving was practiced across the UK. It was January 9th, a bitterly cold Saturday morning. The snow on the fell tops had begun to melt, sending a chill stream through the sinkholes that feed the cave. Members of a university caving club, reports later identified them as a group of students and instructors from the Lancaster University Speleological Society, set out for a training trip into the Lancaster Hole entrance of the system. Their plan was simple: descend the main shaft, explore the connecting passages toward the Easegill main drain, and return by evening. Lancaster Hole was a favourite among northern clubs because of its impressive 30-metre entrance pitch, a vertical drop leading into one of the most direct routes into the caverns. It had been rigged thousands of times before. The shaft opened wide at the top and narrowed as it descended, lined with rough limestone. The team arrived mid-morning, unpacked their ropes, and began setting up anchors at the usual rigging points. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The group checked their gear, secured the main line, and began the descent one by one. Voices echoed up the shaft, the familiar rhythm of rope work and shouted instructions. Below, in the chamber at the bottom, others prepared to move forward along the stream passage. Then, without warning, the mountain shifted. Witnesses described a dull crack, a sound like distant thunder, followed by a roar. Limestone blocks, loosened from the roof and sides of the shaft, suddenly broke free. In a matter of seconds, tons of rock fell through the vertical pitch. Those still descending had no time to react. The falling debris struck the rope, the ledges, and the cavers below. Dust and fragments filled the air, blinding everyone in the darkness. When the rumble finally stopped, silence returned to the cave, a silence broken only by the drip of water and the sound of groaning rock. The surviving members called out to one another, but several voices never answered. The rescue call went out just after noon. The Cave Rescue Organisation, CRO, based in Clapham, was mobilised immediately. Within an hour, dozens of rescuers from across Yorkshire and Cumbria were on their way, carrying stretchers, medical kits and rigging equipment across the moor. Snow was falling again, making access difficult. The only route to Lancaster Hole was a rough path over open fell land, so everything had to be carried by hand. When the first team reached the entrance and descended, the scale of the collapse became clear. The shaft was choked with debris, the rope frayed and pinned under boulders. It took several hours just to make the route safe enough for rescuers to reach the chamber below. There, they found devastation. 3 cavers had been killed instantly by the impact. Others were injured but alive, huddled under ledges that had shielded them from the main fall. One rescuer later described the scene as complete chaos, with shattered rock and tangled ropes everywhere. The operation to bring the survivors out began that night and continued into the following day. carried out under freezing temperatures and constant risk of further collapse. By the early hours of January 10th, all the living had been brought to the surface. The bodies of the 3 victims followed soon after, carried out through snow and darkness by teams of rescuers who had been underground for more than 15 hours. The following week, the inquest began in Lancaster. It was attended by members of the British Cave Rescue Council, geologists from regional universities, and leaders of caving clubs across northern England. The question on everyone's mind was how such a catastrophic collapse could occur in a well-known and regularly used shaft. Geologists examining the site found that the rockfall had originated from a weakness in the ceiling near the upper lip of the pitch. Freeze-thaw cycles from the harsh winter had widened existing fractures. Water from melting snow had seeped into these cracks, refrozen overnight and expanded, slowly prying apart the limestone. When the temperature rose that weekend, the pressure released, dislodging a large mass of rock. The heavy snowmelt also increased the underground stream flow, adding vibration that may have triggered the collapse at the exact moment the group was inside. The investigation found no fault with the cavers themselves. Their rigging had been correct, their ropes and anchors in good condition. But the incident exposed a vulnerability in how entrances and vertical drops were assessed for safety. Until then, most clubs relied on visual checks for loose rock, tapping with a hammer or testing holds by hand. Structural inspection by experts was rare. As a result of the inquest, new national guidelines were introduced for vertical caving in the UK. The British Caving Association urged all clubs to carry out pre-trip stability assessments for entrance pitches, especially in winter months. The CRO added rockfall risk management to its rescue training curriculum, teaching rescuers how to evaluate unstable ceilings before sending teams below. The report also highlighted the need for redundant rigging, recommending that ropes be anchored to multiple points rather than a single main bolt or natural feature. That practice soon became standard. Many caves across the Dales, including Lancaster Hole, had their main anchors replaced with stainless steel bolts installed by trained technicians. Beyond safety regulations, the tragedy left a deep impression on the caving community. Easegill Caverns had always been a symbol of collaboration, a system connecting multiple entrances and routes explored over decades by countless clubs. Now it was also a reminder of fragility. The rock overhead, once trusted, was seen differently. For the survivors, recovery took months. Some returned to caving, determined not to let fear take hold. Others never went underground again. Memorial services were held on Lech Fell that spring, attended by hundreds of cavers from all over the country. A plaque was placed near the Lancaster Hole entrance, bearing the names of the 3 who died that day. In the years that followed, Easegill continued to be explored and mapped, eventually becoming the backbone of the 3 counties system, linking Yorkshire, Lancashire and Cumbria through a continuous underground network. But among those who train new cavers there, the 1988 incident remains part of every safety briefing, a case study that changed how the community thinks about the rock itself. Every winter since, when frost grips the dales and water freezes along the surface streams, instructors remind their teams what happened that January day. They check bolts twice, test ceilings, and listen carefully for the faint crack of shifting limestone. The sound that once heard too late reshaped the practice of caving across Britain. Porth Ogof Exit Pool, South Wales, UK, between 1970s and 1990s. In the quiet valleys of South Wales near the village of Ystrad the river Melter disappears underground into a wide limestone opening called Porth Ogof, the gateway to the cave. For centuries, locals knew it as a place of mystery and danger. The cave's entrance yawns open like a dark mouth beneath the trees, drawing in the river and swallowing it whole. Inside lies one of Britain's most complex river caves. Beautiful, deceptive, and deadly. From the surface, Porth Ogof looks inviting. Families visit the picnic area nearby. Hikers walk the paths above it. Many approach the entrance, taking photos beside the cold, black water. But what looks like a calm underground stream is in fact a series of deep, water-filled chambers and tight underwater routes. The most notorious of these is the exit pool, a seemingly still body of water that has taken more lives than any other cave feature in the United Kingdom. The cave stretches roughly 2 kilometres underground, with more than 15 separate entrances. It's a network carved by the Melty River over thousands of years. twisting passages, low ceilings, and sumps connecting one chamber to another. Some parts can be walked through, others require crawling or swimming. For trained cavers, it's an accessible and rewarding system, but for decades it also attracted untrained explorers, school groups, and tourists who underestimated its power. By the 1970s, Porth Ogof had gained a reputation among local rescuers as a black spot. The combination of easy access and deceptively calm water led to a growing number of drownings. The most dangerous area was always the exit pool, the point where the underground river emerges back into daylight. Here, the water funnels through a narrow submerged passage before rising into an open basin. To the eye, it looks like a simple pond, but just below the surface lies a siphon strong enough to pull a person under in seconds. In 1971, one of the earliest recorded tragedies occurred when a group of teenagers from a local outdoor club entered the cave during a trip. Several of them tried to swim across the exit pool to reach the daylight beyond. The current was invisible, the water icy. One boy slipped beneath the surface and vanished. His body was recovered later by divers, wedged deep in the submerged passage. The rescue team, members of the South and Mid Wales Cave Rescue Team, described the conditions as among the most dangerous they had ever faced. After that incident, warning signs were placed near the entrance, advising against swimming or entering without proper training, but the cave remained open and accidents continued. In 1975, another young man drowned in the same pool after losing his footing on the slippery rocks. In 1983, 2 more divers were caught by the siphon while exploring the submerged passages near the exit. Each time the pattern was the same: calm water, sudden suction, and almost no chance of escape. By the mid-1980s, Porth Ogof had become the focus of national attention. Newspapers began referring to it as the cave that kills, and local councils debated whether to close access altogether. Caving organisations pushed back, arguing that the site could remain open if people respected the risks and followed basic safety rules. Outdoor education centres began using it for supervised trips, teaching navigation and water awareness. But despite the presence of instructors, the tragedies did not stop. In 1984, a school group from Cardiff entered the cave on a wet spring afternoon. Rain had fallen heavily the day before, raising the water levels in the underground river. The instructors decided to continue, judging conditions as safe enough for an introductory trip. Near the exit pool, 2 students slipped into the current. The instructors managed to pull one out, but the second disappeared beneath the surface. The rescue team that arrived hours later found the body trapped in the siphon, the same deadly spot that had claimed so many before. The inquest that followed was a turning point. Experts testified about the unique hydrology of the cave. The exit pool, they explained, behaves like a plug hole. As the river flows underground, pressure differences between the submerged tunnels and the open pool create a strong inward current. Even strong swimmers cannot fight it once they're pulled in. The coroner described the cave as an attractive menace, urging authorities to increase warnings and restrict unsupervised access. By the 1990s, a series of additional fatalities, including one in 1992 involving an experienced caver caught by rising water, led to a complete reassessment of how the site was managed. The Brecon Beacons National Park Authority, working with the British Cave Rescue Council and local clubs, introduced a new system of signage and safety zoning. Bright yellow warning boards were placed at all entrances stating clearly, "Danger of drowning, the cave has claimed lives." At the same time, outdoor instructors were required to undergo certified training for water-based caving. A set of strict weather and water level criteria was introduced. If rainfall exceeded certain thresholds, all cave trips were cancelled. This became one of the first examples in Britain of a formalised access culture, where education and responsibility replaced unrestricted exploration. Despite these measures, the exit pool remained unpredictable. Divers studying the site in the late 1990s found that the shape of the underwater passage changed subtly with each flood. Sediment build-up or collapse could alter the flow, sometimes making the current stronger or redirecting it entirely. For rescue teams, that meant every recovery was different and dangerous. Many who took part in those operations later described the experience of diving into the exit pool as one of disorientation and claustrophobia. Even with modern equipment, the visibility was near zero, and the suction effect could drag divers off course. Rescuers also began keeping detailed logs of every incident. Between 1970 and 1998, at least 10 people were confirmed to have drowned in Porth Ogof, most of them in or near the exit pool. The true number may be higher, as earlier deaths were not always formally recorded. Each case added to the cave's dark reputation, a place where even a few seconds of carelessness could prove fatal. Today, the cave is still open to visitors, though access is carefully managed. The area is popular with walkers and photographers, and thousands of people visit each year without entering the water. For cavers, it remains both a challenge and a reminder. The exit pool, still dark and still, looks no different than it did half a century ago. Yet beneath that calm surface, the same hidden current moves with quiet force, unchanged and unrelenting. Every local rescue volunteer, every instructor who brings students there, knows the stories. The warnings carved not into stone but into memory. They speak of how easy it is to step too close, to think the water is still, and to underestimate the invisible pull of a river that has claimed lives for decades. In the culture of British caving, Porth Ogof stands apart, a place where the rules of respect, preparation and awareness were written by those who never came back from the dark pool at the cave's end. Schroeders Cave, New York, USA, 1965. In the wooded hills near Canaharia, New York, the land looks quiet. Limestone cliffs, farm fields, and small streams cutting through the forest. But beneath the surface lies a narrow cave system known as Schroeders Cave, a place of fascination for local cavers and geology students in the 1960s. It was one of the few wild caves in the region with a running stream, small passages, and a sump, a flooded tunnel that had never been explored to its end. In April 1965, that sump became the focus of a daring exploration attempt that ended in one of the most haunting cave rescues in American history. The caver was James Gilman Mitchell, a 20-year-old student from Herkimer, New York. He had been exploring caves in the Mohawk Valley for years and was well known among local clubs. Mitchell was studying geology and had an almost scientific obsession with mapping unexplored systems. Schroeders Cave was small, only a few hundred feet long, but to Mitchell it represented a challenge few others had attempted. At the back of the cave, the stream disappeared into a narrow water-filled tunnel believed to connect to deeper chambers. He wanted to be the first to pass through it. On April 30th, 1965, Mitchell entered the cave with a small team of friends. They brought ropes, carbide lamps, and basic diving gear, a face mask and an air hose attached to a hand pump outside the sump. This was before modern cave diving practices were widespread in the United States. Their setup was improvised but typical of the era. One diver exploring ahead, with friends feeding air and communication lines through the passage. Mitchell stripped down to coveralls and boots, tied the hose to his waist, and crawled into the narrow tunnel. The water was cold and muddy, flowing steadily. The sump angled downward, forcing him to go head first. His companions watched the air bubbles rise, listening for his voice to echo back. At first, everything seemed fine. He called out to say he was moving forward, describing the rock formations as he went. Then, after several minutes, the line stopped moving. The air bubbles slowed, then ceased. His friends shouted into the tunnel but got no reply. They tried pulling gently on the hose, but it wouldn't budge. Somewhere ahead, it had kinked or wedged against the rock. The sump had turned silent. They knew immediately something was wrong. Two of them rushed to the nearby farmhouse of the cave's owner, asking him to call the police. Within hours, local firefighters and members of the National Speleological Society arrived. They quickly realised how dangerous the situation was. The tunnel was too narrow for an adult to turn around in, barely wide enough for a human chest. The water filled most of the space, leaving only a few inches of air at the top. Visibility was zero. Rescue teams tried everything they could. Pumps were brought in to lower the water level, but the flow from the underground stream was too strong. They attempted to push oxygen through the air hose, hoping he might still be alive in an air pocket beyond the blockage. Hours turned into a full day. There was no response. As news spread, the scene outside the cave grew crowded. Dozens of volunteers arrived, along with cavers from as far away as Pennsylvania. The US Air Force even flew in specialized rescue equipment from a base in Maryland, compressors, underwater breathing apparatus, and lighting systems. For a small town in upstate New York, it was unlike anything they had ever seen. The cave entrance, little more than a crawlway beneath a limestone ledge, became the centre of a 72-hour operation. Divers went in shifts, working blind, feeling along the tunnel walls for any sign of Mitchell. But the passage twisted irregularly, tightening into choke points that even the slimmest rescuers could not pass. The water temperature hovered just above freezing, numbing hands within minutes. One rescuer later described the conditions as like swimming inside a stone coffin. By the second night, hope was fading. The sump was simply too constricted for anyone to reach him safely. Engineers discussed drilling a parallel shaft from the surface, but the risk of collapse and flooding made it impossible. The rock above was unstable, and even a small mistake could cause the entire passage to seal forever. On May 2nd, rescue leaders made the agonising decision to end the operation. The county sheriff, after consulting with engineers and safety officials, declared that continued attempts would almost certainly result in more deaths. The cave was sealed with rocks and timber to prevent further entry. Mitchell's parents, who had been waiting at the site since the first day, agreed with the decision. Their son's body would remain in the sump where he had become trapped. Over the following weeks, investigators studied the events in detail. They determined that Mitchell had likely become wedged in a constriction about 30 feet from the sump's entrance. The air hose had either kinked or been pressed shut by shifting gravel, cutting off his air supply. Because the passage was completely water-filled, there was no chance for him to turn or retreat once stuck. The water pressure and the shape of the tunnel left him with no escape route. The tragedy shocked the American caving community. Cave diving in the mid-1960s was still in its infancy, with few established safety standards. Mitchell's death underscored how little was understood about sump dynamics and the risks of confined underwater passages. In the years that followed, caving organisations across the country introduced new training requirements for any trip involving flooded tunnels. Divers began using independent air tanks rather than surface-fed hoses, and rescue groups developed specialised recovery procedures for trapped explorers. At Schroeders Pants Cave, the local community erected a small stone marker near the entrance. It bore his name and the year, 1965, along with a simple message honouring his courage. The cave itself was closed for decades afterward, reopened only to scientific teams studying its geology. Even today, access is heavily restricted. Those who have mapped its upper chambers say the sump still looks exactly as it did the day the rescue ended. A narrow, silent fissure half filled with muddy water, leading into darkness that no one has entered since. For locals, the story became part of the region's history. Older residents still remember the sound of helicopters overhead, the hum of generators in the night, and the lines of people standing in the rain outside the cordoned area. It was one of those rare moments when a small rural community became the focus of national attention, not for triumph, but for the limits of human effort. Schroeders Pants Cave remains to this day the final resting place of James Gilman Mitchell, the young caver who went in search of a passage no one had ever seen. His story endures among explorers as a quiet warning that even the most experienced and determined among them can meet a place where skill, courage, and technology are not enough. Nutty Putty Cave, Utah, USA, 2009. South of Salt Lake City, the Utah desert looks quiet and harmless. Rolling hills, dry valleys, and the shimmering surface of Utah Lake. Hidden beneath that landscape is a maze of narrow tunnels and clay-lined passages known as Nutty Putty Cave. To the untrained eye, it doesn't look like much. A small opening on a hillside just wide enough to crawl through. But once inside, the cave twists into hundreds of feet of tight, winding channels, many barely large enough for a human body. For years, it was a popular spot for local cavers, Boy Scout groups, and college students looking for adventure. On November 24, 2009, that reputation changed forever. That evening, John Edward Jones, a 26-year-old medical student from St. George, Utah, arrived at the cave with friends and family. It was just before Thanksgiving, and the group wanted one last outing together before the holiday. John had caved before, mostly in wider, easier systems, but this was his first trip to Nutty Putty. He came with his younger brother, Josh, who had more experience in tight crawls. The two were close, both athletic, both calm under pressure. They entered the cave around 8 p.m, crawling through the main passage known as the Big Slide, and deeper towards an area called the Birth Canal, named for its narrow squeeze. The group was in good spirits, laughing and taking turns leading the way. Nutty Putty's passages were a mix of dry limestone and sticky clay that clung to clothing, making movement slow but manageable. At some point, John decided to explore a side passage he believed was the entrance to the birth canal. It wasn't. In the dim light of his headlamp, he'd taken a wrong turn into an uncharted fissure. A tunnel later measured at just 10 inches wide and 18 inches high. It sloped sharply downward at an angle of nearly 70 degrees. He moved forward on his stomach head first, pushing his arms in front and wriggling inch by inch. About 18 feet in, he realised the tunnel was narrowing, not opening. When he tried to back out, he couldn't. He exhaled to slide back slightly, but his chest wedged tighter. The clay-coated limestone created suction against his body. He was now pinned nearly upside down, his head angled below his chest, feet barely visible in the passage behind him. When his brother Josh reached the junction and heard his voice echoing from the narrow shaft, he knew immediately that something was wrong. He tried to pull him out, grabbing his ankles and heaving backward, but there was no movement. The walls were too tight and the angle too steep. Josh stayed with him, talking calmly, while another member of the group scrambled to the surface to call for help. The first rescue team arrived within an hour, members of the Utah County Sheriff's Search and Rescue. By then, John had been trapped for almost 2 hours. The rescuers crawled through hundreds of feet of narrow passages to reach him. The tunnel was so tight that only one person could work at a time. They began setting up a rope and pulley system, hoping to pull him backward while anchoring ropes along the rock. The air inside was hot, humid and suffocating, and working conditions were brutal. The rescuers had to lie flat in the mud, arms extended, while trying to attach carabiners to a harness around his legs. They brought down oxygen tubes and communication lines, but even passing these through the cramped passage took precious time. Above ground, more than 100 people, volunteers, medics, engineers, gathered around the small cave entrance. They set up floodlights, tents and air compressors, transforming the lonely desert into a nighttime rescue camp. Inside, the rescuers talked constantly to John, trying to keep him calm. He prayed aloud, quoted scripture, and spoke to his wife over the radio, who was waiting outside with their 1-year-old daughter. Despite the pain, he stayed hopeful, even joking with the rescuers that he would buy them pizza when it was over. But the clock was against him. Being trapped upside down created deadly internal pressure. Blood pooled in his head and lungs, making breathing harder with each passing hour. After several failed attempts to pull him free, the rescuers realised the rope system was slipping against the smooth limestone. They devised a new plan, a complex pulley anchored to bolts drilled directly into the rock. For that, they needed to bring down drills, steel rods, and more ropes through the tight entrance. Every piece of equipment had to be passed hand to hand through the narrow crawlway. By 6 a.m, after nearly 10 hours underground, they managed to lift him several inches upward. Cheers echoed through the tunnels. It seemed he might finally come free. Then, without warning, one of the anchors failed. A pulley snapped loose, sending rescuers crashing against the walls. The movement forced John deeper into the fissure. He groaned in pain. The failure set them back to where they had started. From that point on, the operation became a race against time. Medical personnel monitored his condition from the surface. Oxygen was low and his pulse had grown irregular. Rescuers rotated shifts, each spending no more than 20 minutes at the site before backing out to recover. The stress and heat inside the cave were unbearable. By the next evening, more than 24 hours since he became trapped, John was showing signs of heart failure. His breathing was shallow, his voice weak. Rescuers administered oxygen through a tube and tried again to widen the passage with drills, but the rock was dense and fractured unpredictably. One false move could trigger a collapse that would bury them all. They worked in silence, lit only by headlamps, listening to the sound of the drills echoing through the limestone. At around midnight on November 25th, John lost consciousness. The team called for medical verification, and after repeated attempts to revive him, he was pronounced dead at 11:56 p.m. He had been trapped for 27 hours. The rescuers, many of them seasoned veterans, broke down as the news reached the surface. They had been only a few feet away, close enough to touch his boots, but the angle, the rock, and gravity itself had made it impossible. The authorities faced a grim decision. Removing the body would require dismantling much of the surrounding rock, risking another collapse and putting more lives in danger. After consulting with engineers and the family, officials decided to leave him where he was. The passage was sealed with concrete, turning the narrow fissure into a tomb. In the days that followed, Nutty Putty Cave was closed permanently. The Bureau of Land Management placed a steel gate over the entrance and filled the surrounding tunnels with rock and cement. A small plaque was later installed near the site, inscribed with his name, John Edward Jones, 1983-2009. The tragedy spread quickly across the country. News outlets replayed the story for weeks, a rescue so desperate and public that it exposed the hidden dangers of recreational caving. Utah's caving community, long known for its family trips and training clubs, began rewriting its access policies. The state's land agencies and cave organizations established new standards for mapping, supervision, and safety, particularly in small, tight systems like Nutty Putty. For those who'd been there, the memory never faded. The rescuers described it as the hardest operation of their lives, a mission that tested not only their skill but their endurance and humanity. Above the sealed hillside, the wind still blows through the dry Utah grass, where the cave's entrance once opened to the curious. Now, only a small bronze plaque marks the spot where one man's last exploration became a permanent part of the Earth itself. Vortex Spring, Cave System, Florida, USA, 2010. In the flat, pine-covered lands of northwest Florida, where crystal blue springs feed rivers that run to the Gulf, lies a place that has long drawn divers from around the world, Vortex Spring. On the surface it looks calm and inviting, a clear turquoise pool surrounded by sandy banks and picnic tables. Beneath it, however, runs a vast and treacherous network of submerged tunnels known to cave divers as both a paradise and a trap. In August 2010, one man entered those tunnels and never came back. His name was Ben McDaniel, and his disappearance remains one of the most haunting mysteries in American diving history. Ben was 30 years old, from Collierville, Tennessee. He had been living at Vortex Spring for several months, renting a small cabin on the property and diving almost every day. To those who met him, he seemed deeply focused, friendly, curious, but carrying something heavy. Earlier that year, his younger brother had died unexpectedly, and Ben had retreated to Florida to find peace in the quiet world beneath the water. Diving, he told friends, was the only place where his mind felt still. Vortex Spring was unlike most dive sites. At its entrance, the spring opens into a large circular pool about 50 feet across. Below that, a limestone tunnel descends into the earth, a system of underwater chambers that extends more than 1,600 feet, with narrow restrictions and dead ends. Because of its complexity, access beyond a certain point was controlled by a heavy iron gate. Only certified cave divers, with years of training and proper equipment, were allowed to pass through. Ben wasn't one of them. On the afternoon of August 18, 2010, Ben spoke briefly with staff at the dive shop, filling his tanks and logging the entry time as he had many times before. Witnesses said he seemed relaxed. Around 7:30 p.m, two experienced divers, Eduardo Turan and Chuck Cronin, saw him at the entrance to the cave. They chatted briefly, and Ben told them he planned to go a little farther in. The other divers finished their dives and left before dark. Ben stayed behind. That night, the lights on his pickup truck still glowed in the parking lot. His wallet, keys and phone were locked inside. The next morning, when staff noticed the truck still there, they called for help. Within hours, a search team of cave divers descended into the system to look for him. The first to enter was Pavel Azimov, one of Vortex's most experienced divers. He and his team reached the locked gate, which they found open. The padlock had been removed and set aside. They went beyond, following the main passage as it dropped deeper into the earth. Silt clouds stirred at every movement, turning the water into thick haze. They followed guidelines, thin ropes stretched along the tunnel walls, leading to the deepest sections. No sign of Ben. Over the following days, more teams arrived. Divers scoured every chamber, every crevice where a body could have been caught. They searched all the way to the cave's deepest known point, 1,600 feet in, at a depth of more than 150 feet. The passages there are barely wide enough for a person to pass through, forcing divers to crawl while carrying multiple air tanks. Still, they found nothing, no equipment, no marks, no trace. What baffled investigators was that the searchers had gone far beyond where Ben was thought capable of reaching. Cave diving at that depth and distance requires specialized training and redundant systems, at least 3 tanks, multiple lights and strict air management rules. Ben had open water certification only, which allows divers to swim in daylight zones, never in enclosed caves. Yet something had driven him to go beyond that barrier. As the days turned into weeks, theories multiplied. Some believed his body had become trapped in an unseen crevice or collapse. Others wondered if he had intentionally staged his disappearance. Friends rejected that idea, insisting he had made plans for the future and seemed hopeful. Still, the absence of a body fueled speculation. At the surface, the Holmes County Sheriff's Office coordinated the investigation. Deputies found no sign of foul play. Ben's truck held his personal items, including his phone and dive log. The gate lock, recovered by investigators, showed no damage, suggesting it had been opened with a key, possibly one borrowed or duplicated from an employee. Meanwhile, volunteer divers continued searching for weeks. The conditions grew worse with each attempt: silt, poor visibility, and collapsing clay walls. Several divers nearly became trapped themselves. One rescue diver told reporters the cave just eats people, describing passages that could close or shift as sediment moved. By early September, officials reluctantly called off the search. They had explored every known chamber and even drained surface areas to check for possible exits. Nothing. Vortex Spring's owner, Lowell Kelly, posted a $10,000 reward for any information leading to Ben's recovery. Then, 2 months later, another tragedy struck. Kelly himself drowned at the spring while diving alone, just yards from where Ben had vanished. His death deepened the mystery surrounding the site. In the years since, Ben's disappearance has been re-examined countless times by divers, investigators, and journalists. The most accepted theory remains that he ventured deep beyond the gate, became disoriented in the silt and perished in a passage too narrow or unstable for rescuers to reach. Some divers who know the system well believe his body may have been carried into a side fissure during a collapse, permanently sealed by clay and rock. Others think he never went that far, that he may have turned back, surfaced unnoticed and vanished elsewhere. No evidence ever supported that, but the uncertainty lingers. The incident changed the way Vortex Spring operated. Access to the cave system was completely restructured. A new gate was installed with stricter controls and records of who entered and when. Only certified cave divers are now permitted beyond the entrance tunnel, and even then, only with supervision. Training programs were revised nationwide, emphasizing the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of respecting depth and qualification limits. For divers who still visit Vortex, the entrance pool remains as beautiful as ever. Clear, calm, reflecting the sky like glass. But beneath that surface lies a warning written in silence. Every year, instructors point to the Iron Gate and tell new students the same story, of a diver who believed he could go just a little farther, and who never returned. His family continues to visit the site, leaving flowers on the bank each August. The reward for information remains unclaimed. Ben McDaniel's body was never found. The cave, cold and dark, keeps its secret still. Plura Cave, Rana, Norway, 2014. In the far north of Norway, where winter locks the valleys in ice and silence, the water never really stops moving. Beneath a frozen surface outside the town of Rana runs a hidden world of flooded tunnels. Plura Cave, one of the deepest underwater cave systems in Europe. The passages wind for more than 2 kilometers beneath layers of rock, connecting 2 natural springs, Plura Grotta and Steinugler Flagget, through a series of narrow, pitch-black corridors filled with icy water. It's a place of breathtaking beauty and lethal risk. In February 2014, it became the scene of a tragedy and one of the most daring cave recovery missions ever recorded. That winter, a team of experienced Finnish cave divers travelled to Norway to attempt a challenging traverse of the system, a full underwater journey from one entrance to the other. The dive would stretch more than 2,000 metres, with depths reaching almost 130 metres at the deepest point. It was one of the longest and most technical cave dives possible, requiring perfect planning, redundant systems and absolute discipline. The team consisted of 5 men: Kari Huotarinen, Jari Huotarinen, Petteri Valikainen, Jari Uusitalo and Kai Kankanpää. All were veteran divers, trained in mixed gas rebreather technology and capable of handling extreme decompression schedules. They had prepared for months, studying maps, rehearsing emergency procedures, and calculating every stage of gas use and decompression stops. On the morning of February 6, 2014, The air temperature outside was well below freezing. The surface of the Plura River was a sheet of ice. Beneath it, the divers' lights would be the only source of brightness in total darkness. They began the dive from the Plura entrance, planning to follow the main tunnel system underwater for more than 3 hours, then exit through Steinugler Flagget on the far side of the mountain. The first section went smoothly. The tunnel was wide and clear with good visibility. But as they descended past 110 metres, conditions began to change. The tunnel narrowed and silt from the cave floor began to rise, turning the water into a brown haze. Visibility dropped to near zero. In this environment, a diver must rely entirely on tactile awareness, following a guideline stretched along the floor to find direction. At some point beyond the halfway mark, 2 of the divers encountered trouble. One, Kari Hotterinen, appeared to suffer from a sudden loss of consciousness, possibly caused by nitrogen narcosis or oxygen toxicity, both risks at that depth. His dive partner, Jari Uusitalo, tried to assist, but manoeuvring in the confined space was almost impossible. As he attempted to stabilise him, Hotterinen drifted downward and became wedged in a narrow restriction. In the struggle, Uusitalo's own equipment was damaged, forcing him to retreat. Behind them, Jari Hotterinen, Kari's brother, and Kai Kankanpaa moved forward to help. The confined space turned the rescue attempt into chaos. In the silt-filled water, lights were useless. Somewhere in that confusion, a second diver, Jari Hotterinen, also succumbed, likely from a gas imbalance or exhaustion. When the remaining 3 finally managed to regroup, they were shaken, low on gas and still deep inside the system. They faced an impossible choice: continue forward into unknown territory with 2 bodies behind them, or turn back toward the entrance and risk decompression sickness. They chose survival. The return journey took more than 4 hours, including decompression stops at multiple depths to prevent nitrogen bubbles from forming in their blood. They surfaced at Plura late that night, exhausted and traumatized, with frost forming on their masks as they broke through the ice. When they reached the surface, they immediately reported the accident to Norwegian authorities. Rescue divers from the Norwegian police and military soon arrived. But Plura was no ordinary cave. The water was near freezing, and the system's depth and narrow restrictions made recovery extremely dangerous. After several attempts, officials declared the bodies unrecoverable. The risks were too great, even for professional rescue divers, who were not specialised in extreme cave systems. The decision was made to seal the site temporarily, leaving the 2 men entombed. For the survivors, the idea of leaving their friends behind was unbearable. In the months that followed, they planned their own recovery mission, a volunteer effort led by the same Finnish diving community that had trained with the victims. With permission from Norwegian authorities, they returned in March 2014, assembling a team of 11 divers supported by logistics experts, medical staff, and decompression specialists. The operation would take place under the ice, in total darkness, at depths few humans had ever reached. They spent days preparing, cutting access holes through the ice, staging oxygen tanks and decompression gases at different depths, and securing the safety line through the entire system. Every detail had to be exact. One mistake at that depth could mean instant death. On March 27th, the recovery dive began. Diver Juni Lepajärvi led the team. They followed the same route as the original expedition, descending carefully along the guideline through the winding tunnels. It took over 2 hours to reach the site of the accident. The water was still clouded with fine silt, and the bodies were found exactly where the survivors had described. One trapped in a restriction at around 110 metres, the other a short distance beyond. Working slowly, the team used lifting bags and careful manoeuvring to free the bodies without disturbing the rock walls. It was one of the deepest recovery operations ever carried out by civilians. Every movement had to be calculated to avoid stirring the silt or damaging the delicate breathing systems. The divers spent nearly 10 hours underwater, completing their decompression stops in stages as they ascended back toward the ice hole. When they finally surfaced, both men had been recovered. It was a moment of quiet relief. The mission had succeeded without injury, thanks to meticulous planning and deep trust among the team. Norwegian authorities praised the divers for their courage and discipline, noting that few professional rescue units could have accomplished what they had done. In the aftermath, the Plura tragedy reshaped cave diving safety discussions across Europe. training organisations began revising their procedures for extreme depth dives, emphasising team structure, redundancy, and psychological readiness. The recovery team's discipline, every movement timed, every breath measured, became a model of professionalism in a field often defined by improvisation. Today, Plura Cave remains a place of both awe and caution. Divers still visit, drawn by its clear blue entrances and the challenge of its immense underwater halls. But those who descend into the system pass a memorial plaque placed by the Finnish divers near the site of the accident, engraved with the names Kari Huhtarinen and Jari Huhtarinen, brothers in life and in loss. In winter, when the ice seals over the entrance again and the valley falls silent, the water beneath stays exactly as it was, cold, dark, and absolute. For those who know what happened there, Plura is more than a cave. It is a reminder of how far humans will go for exploration, and how thin the line can be between mastery and surrender in the world beneath the ice. Boesmansgat, Bushman's Hole, Northern Cape, South Africa, 1994 and 2005. In the arid highlands of South Africa's Northern Cape, far from the coast or any large body of water, lies a flooded sinkhole that defies the landscape around it. Locals call it Boesmansgat, or Bushman's Hole, a vertical shaft of cold, dark water plunging deep into the earth. On the surface it looks like an ordinary farm pond, circular, greenish, calm, but beneath that surface the water drops straight down into one of the deepest freshwater caves on Earth, more than 280 metres deep. For cave divers, it represents both the ultimate challenge and a deadly temptation. Two men, separated by 11 years, entered that darkness and never came back. The first was Deon Dreyer, a 20-year-old diver from Johannesburg. It was December 17, 1994, a summer day in South Africa, when Dreyer joined a team led by Nuno Gomes, one of the country's most experienced deep divers. The expedition's goal was to map the bottom of Boesmansgat and test new equipment. Dreyer was young but skilled, confident in his abilities and eager to learn. The team planned a deep dive to around 200 metres, a depth that required careful gas mixtures, precise decompression stops and mental control. The water in Boesmansgat is cold, averaging about 18 degrees Celsius at the surface and dropping sharply with depth. The light fades quickly, and by 50 metres it becomes completely black. Visibility depends on the silt that clings to the walls. One wrong movement can stir clouds that erase all sense of direction. The divers descended one by one, their lights glowing like faint orbs in the abyss. Somewhere around 60 metres, Dreyer was seen adjusting his mask. A few minutes later, as the others reached deeper levels, he disappeared from sight. When they surfaced more than an hour later, his dive line was empty. At first, they thought he might have surfaced elsewhere, but his gear and bubbles were gone. Rescue divers searched for 2 days but never found him. The cave's depth and temperature made it impossible to continue. Deon Dreyer's body had vanished into the blackness. For years, his family left flowers by the sinkhole's edge, waiting for news that never came. The diving community treated Boesmansgat with quiet respect. It was known for its danger, a place where the margin for error vanished with each metre down. A decade later, another diver arrived at the same pool with a different mission. Dave Shaw, an Australian-born airline pilot living in Hong Kong, was one of the world's leading technical divers. He specialised in deep closed-circuit rebreather diving, a system that recycles air allowing for longer, quieter, and more efficient descents. Shaw was fascinated by Boesmansgat's reputation and by the story of Deon Dreyer. In October 2004, Shaw made a record-breaking dive in the hole, reaching 270 metres, near the very bottom. During that dive, as his light swept across the silt-covered floor, he saw something unexpected. A human body, perfectly preserved by the cold, oxygen-poor water. It was Dreyer. His dive light, still attached to his helmet, glowed faintly through the haze. Shaw decided he would return to recover him. The plan for the recovery was meticulous. It would take place in January 2005, during the South African summer. The operation involved more than a dozen divers, including medical staff, support teams, and Dreyer's parents, who came to the site hoping to finally bring their son home. The dive required precise timing. Shaw would descend with a helmet-mounted camera, body bag, and tether lines. His partner, Don Shirley, an experienced instructor and close friend, would meet him partway up to assist with decompression. On the morning of January 8, 2005, the water was still. The team gathered at dawn, the desert air cool and quiet. Shaw stood at the edge of the sinkhole in full gear. His rebreather, multiple tanks, lights and harnesses weighed nearly 80 kilograms. He entered the water and began his descent, each breath recycled through the rebreather as he slipped deeper into the darkness. It took him nearly 15 minutes to reach the bottom. His dive light flickered across the silt where he had last seen Dryer. The body was still there, but something had changed. The gases trapped in Dryer's tissues over the years had expanded, making the body buoyant. When Shaw tried to maneuver it into the bag, it began to float, twisting and pulling against him. The lines tangled. The body's movements stirred up clouds of fine sediment, instantly erasing visibility. In total darkness, 270 meters below the surface, Shaw's breathing grew strained. His rebreather sensors began to misread oxygen levels, a deadly complication at that depth. The tangle of ropes around his arms and lights made movement impossible. As he fought to free himself, his body overloaded with carbon dioxide. Above him, his dive computer kept ticking through the minutes, but Shaw never moved again. When he failed to appear at the planned rendezvous point, Don Shirley, waiting at 120 meters, knew something was wrong. He descended slightly to look for light, but the visibility was zero. His own equipment began to malfunction from the pressure, and he was forced to ascend. On the surface, the rescue teams waited hour after hour, hoping he might still appear. He never did. It took 2 days for divers to locate him. When they finally recovered Shaw's body from the depths, they found something unexpected. Dryer's remains were attached to him, tangled in the same lines. The body bag he'd brought had wrapped around them both. It was as if, in his final act, he'd succeeded in completing the mission he set out to do. The operation to retrieve both bodies was led by police divers and technical experts from South Africa and abroad. Cameras mounted on Shaw's helmet were recovered too, and the footage revealed the final moments of the dive. It showed him calmly working in near-zero visibility, unaware that the limits of human physiology were closing in. The video later became a teaching tool for diving safety, illustrating how rapidly conditions can turn fatal at extreme depths. In total, Shaw's dive lasted over 10 hours, including decompression. The pressure at his final depth was more than 27 times that at the surface, enough to crush ordinary equipment or trigger instant blackout from gas toxicity. The fact that he reached that far at all was a testament to the precision of modern diving technology and human determination. But even the best equipment could not overcome biology. The build-up of carbon dioxide, the narcosis, and the simple weight of the water above. After the recovery, Dryer's remains were returned to his family. They buried him in Johannesburg, finally bringing closure after 11 years. Shaw was buried in Australia, honoured by divers around the world for his bravery. Today, Boesmanskat remains one of the most challenging and respected cave dives on the planet. Few attempt to reach the bottom, and those who do follow strict protocols established after the incident. The water is still, dark and silent, concealing a depth where two of the world's most skilled divers found their limit. On calm days, when the wind is low and the desert heat shimmers over the surface, the pool reflects the sky like glass, a mirror hiding the line between ambition and eternity. Wookey Hole, UK, 1949. In the rolling hills of Somerset, where the River Axe cuts through limestone cliffs, lies Wookey Hole, one of Britain's most famous cave systems. Tourists have visited its illuminated chambers for over a century, but beyond the public walkways, the river disappears into a series of dark, flooded passages that few had ever seen. In the 1930s and 40s, these submerged tunnels became the testing ground for a new kind of exploration, one that merged mountaineering courage with the science of diving. It was here, in 1949, that one of Britain's earliest cave divers lost his life, in a tragedy that would shape the future of the sport. By the end of World War II, Wookey Hole was already legendary among explorers. The first recorded dives into its underwater chambers had taken place in the 1930s, using equipment so primitive that success seemed miraculous. Divers wore heavy canvas suits and brass helmets, connected to surface pumps by long rubber hoses. Each descent was a battle against darkness, cold and pressure. Yet, the promise of discovery, to map what lay beyond the last air-filled chamber, kept them returning. In the years following the war, diving technology began to evolve. Compressed air cylinders replaced surface hoses, and rubber suits offered more freedom of movement. These innovations inspired a new generation of British divers to explore the country's flooded caves. At the centre of this effort was the British Cave Diving Group, CDG, founded in 1946 by Graham Balcombe and Jack Shepherd. The CDG was the world's first organisation devoted entirely to cave diving. Its members were scientists, engineers and explorers, men who saw cave diving as both a technical challenge and a contribution to geology. Wookey Hole became their laboratory. The cave was already mapped through its dry chambers, numbered 1 through 9. But beyond Chamber 9 lay the unknown. The river disappeared under a rock arch into a sump, a flooded tunnel that none had yet passed completely. The mission for the spring of 1949 was to extend exploration beyond this point, using new self-contained equipment. The team that day included Penelope Powell, Graham Balcombe and several younger divers. Among them was a 33-year-old engineer named Robert Davies. Historical records sometimes list variations of his surname. He was an experienced swimmer and had trained with the CDG in Somerset's cold rivers. The plan was simple: descend through the known chambers, set up a base at Chamber 9 and begin diving into the submerged section beyond. The sump water was near freezing, around 8 degrees Celsius, and perfectly clear. Visibility extended several metres, unusual for a cave system. The divers wore heavy dry suits, lead weights and single-cylinder aqua lungs, early versions of the modern scuba system. Communication with the surface was limited to hand signals and written slates. Davies entered the water first, followed by Balcombe. Their goal was to reach a new air pocket beyond the sump, a potential Chamber 10. The passage sloped downward sharply, narrowing into a restriction before opening again. They followed a thin guideline laid along the floor, their only way home in the blackness. At around 30 feet from the entrance, the current strengthened. The underground river surged through the constriction, forcing water and silt into their faces. Balcombe signalled to turn back. Davies, behind him, gave the OK sign and began to retreat. Moments later, Balcombe surfaced alone. He waited, expecting to see Davies's light appear through the green water. It never did. The rescue began immediately. 2 other divers entered, following the guideline back into the sump. Within minutes, they found the line torn loose from one of its anchors. Silt clouds filled the water, reducing visibility to nothing. After several tense dives, they located Davies lying motionless near the restriction, his mouthpiece still in place. His tank was empty. The cause of death was later determined to be asphyxiation from air exhaustion. He had become disoriented when the line detached, wasting precious air searching for the exit. The team worked for hours to recover his body, hauling him through the tight underwater passage back into Chamber 9. They emerged to a crowd of rescuers and local police waiting outside the show cave. It was the first fatality in the history of the British Cave Diving Group, and one of the earliest cave diving deaths ever recorded in the world. The news spread quickly across the UK. Newspapers reported the event as both a tragedy and a lesson in the limits of human exploration. For the CDG, it was devastating, but it also became a turning point. Within months, the organisation began rewriting its operational rules. They introduced the concept of redundant air supply, requiring divers to carry reserve cylinders or surface-fed backup lines. They also standardised the use of continuous guidelines secured at fixed points to prevent the kind of disorientation that had cost Davies his life. In the following years, Wookey Hole remained the CDG's central training site. Teams refined their techniques, slowly pushing deeper into the cave's flooded chambers. Each success was built on lessons learned from earlier mistakes. By the 1950s, they had reached Chamber 12, setting new distance records and proving that systematic planning could overcome the dangers that once seemed insurmountable. The tragedy of 1949 also prompted a shift in how divers were trained. Before then, cave diving had been an informal pursuit, experienced swimmers teaching one another by trial and error. After Wookey Hole, the CDG began formalising its training, combining scientific knowledge with practical instruction. New members underwent physical conditioning, equipment drills and psychological preparation for the claustrophobic environment of underwater caves. Technological innovation followed. British engineers developed smaller, more reliable breathing systems, better masks, and stronger lights designed to withstand depth and cold. The organisation also began documenting every dive, creating detailed maps that are still referenced today. Much of modern cave diving's safety culture, the buddy system, air-sharing protocols and line discipline, traces its roots back to the aftermath of the Wookey Hole accident. In later years, Wookey Hole became a site of both remembrance and progress. In the 1960s, new dives connected it to the nearby St Cuthbert's Swallow system, confirming the vastness of Somerset's underground rivers. The early explorers' gear, including the same style of aqualung used in 1949, is now displayed in the Wookey Hole Museum. Visitors walking the show cave can see the same dark water where the CDG's pioneers once stood, a quiet reminder of how far exploration has come and what it cost to get there. To this day, Wookey Hole remains an active research site, explored by divers using state-of-the-art rebreathers and sonar mapping. Yet even with modern technology, the same rules still apply. Keep the line tight, check your air, trust your partner. They are the unwritten legacies of the diver who didn't come back in 1949, lessons carved into the discipline itself. Alum Pot, UK, 1955. On the western edge of the Yorkshire Dales near the village of Sellside, a narrow crack in the limestone opens into one of Britain's most dramatic vertical shafts. Alum Pot. To the eye it looks like a natural wound in the earth, a steep-sided hole surrounded by grass and stone walls, dropping straight down into darkness. It's one of the classic British potholes, known to generations of cavers as both beautiful and dangerous. At 100 metres deep from rim to floor, with side passages and free-hanging drops, Alum Pot has always demanded precision, teamwork and respect. In 1955, that lesson came at a terrible cost. By the 1950s, caving in Britain was shifting from an exploratory pursuit into a more organised sport. Clubs across the north of England, the Craven Pothole Club, the Red Rose, the Northern Pennine Club, were mapping and documenting the great vertical systems of the Dales. Alum Pot was one of their proving grounds. It offered everything: complex rigging, water hazards, and a massive open shaft that echoed with the sound of waterfalls. For most cavers, descending into its depths was a rite of passage. On a cold morning in April 1955, a group from a university caving club arrived to make a routine descent. The team included a mix of experienced climbers and students, all familiar with vertical techniques of the time: rope ladders, belays and hemp lines rather than the modern nylon ropes used today. The goal was to descend through dolly tubs, a narrow entrance passage that drops steeply into the main shaft, and then to reach the boulder floor far below. Conditions were wet. Rain from the previous night had filled the beck that runs into the pot, sending water cascading down the shaft. Spray hung in the air like mist, soaking everything and making the limestone slick. The sound of falling water made communication difficult, forcing the team to rely on shouted commands and rope tugs. They began rigging the pitch from the upper ledge, anchoring their ladders to natural rock features. The ladders were made of aluminum rungs and steel wire, light for the time but prone to twisting under strain. Each caver clipped on a waist belt with a safety line. The system depended entirely on discipline. One person descending at a time, the rest managing ropes and signals from above. Shortly after noon, one of the group, a young caver named Michael Wilson, as documented in regional accident records, prepared to descend. He was confident and calm, moving methodically as he checked his connections. At that time, the dolly tub's route involved an initial 10-metre drop to a ledge, then a second free-hanging ladder into the main chamber. Wilson began his descent, disappearing into the mist. Below, his voice echoed faintly, signalling that he'd reached the first ledge. Then came another call, something unclear, followed by silence. The others leaned over the rim, listening. Moments later, a sound echoed up from the darkness, a sharp metallic clatter, followed by a thud that reverberated off the walls. The team froze. They shouted his name, but there was no reply. One of the senior members immediately began descending the rope ladder to investigate, moving as quickly as he could without slipping. The spray made visibility almost impossible. Halfway down, he saw the ladder swinging freely in the void. Its lower section had come loose from the belay. Below, the beam of his lamp caught sight of a still figure lying at the bottom of the shaft. The team launched a rescue effort within minutes. A runner was sent to the nearest farmhouse to call the police, while others began organising additional ropes and equipment. the shaft was far too deep for a quick extraction. Even reaching the floor safely took time. Members of the cave rescue organisation, CRO, based in Clapham, were soon alerted. By the time they arrived, the sun had begun to set over the dales. The rescue would take place in total darkness, illuminated only by carbide lamps and handheld torches. The CRO team descended through the dolly tub's entrance with stretchers and medical gear. The conditions were treacherous. Water continued to pour down the shaft, making the ladders sway violently. It took hours to reach the floor, where they confirmed what the university team already feared. Wilson had been killed instantly in the fall. The impact had been severe. It took most of the night to bring his body back to the surface. The operation required multiple relays as rescuers passed the stretcher from one vertical section to another. Each movement had to be coordinated with rope signals, since the roar of water drowned out voices. By dawn, the exhausted team emerged at the rim, covered in mud and spray, carrying the stretcher up onto the moor. The inquest was held several weeks later in Settle. It revealed that the lower ladder had not been properly secured to the main belay point. In the spray-filled darkness, a carabiner clip, a simple metal link, had not fully locked, and the vibration of movement had shaken it loose. When Wilson shifted his weight from the upper ladder to the lower, the attachment slipped free. The ladder fell, and he with it. Investigators noted that communication between the top and bottom teams had been hampered by noise, and the use of non-locking connectors increased risk. The coroner described the event as a tragic accident, but emphasised the need for absolute clarity and redundancy in rigging procedures. The British caving community took those words to heart. Within months, clubs across the Dales began introducing stricter rigging checks before every descent. Teams designated specific roles, one person to rig, one to verify, a practice that became standard across the UK. Written checklists were added to expedition planning, and communication protocols using rope tugs and whistle codes were formalised to supplement verbal calls. The incident also influenced equipment development. At the time, most cavers still relied on hemp or sisal ropes, which absorbed water and weakened quickly. The 1955 Alum Pot accident accelerated the shift towards synthetic nylon ropes, which offered better strength, elasticity and resistance to rot. The same year, British manufacturers began testing climbing-grade nylon for potholing use, leading to the rope standards that continue today. In the years following, Alum Pot remained an important training site for vertical rescue. The CRO used it for simulations, practicing stretcher hauling from the floor to the surface using newly developed pulley systems. Those exercises would later save countless lives in other caves across Britain. To this day, Alum Pot commands both admiration and caution. On clear mornings, sunlight pierces the shaft and lights the walls in bands of gold, revealing the power of the landscape that carved it. But for cavers, it is also a reminder, a place where a single missed clip, a single misunderstood signal was enough to change everything. Each year, new teams descend its depths with modern gear and lighting, checking and double-checking their ropes before committing to the drop. The echo of water still fills the chamber, just as it did in 1955, masking voices and reminding everyone who steps to the edge why discipline and communication remain the bedrock of vertical exploration. Marble Arch, Screen Hill 3, Namesakes, N Island, 1967. In the Green Hills of County Fermanagh, near the border with the Republic of Ireland, the underground world runs as deep as the surface is calm. Beneath the farmland lies a vast labyrinth of flooded tunnels and chambers carved by the Cladach River. The Marble Arch cave system, one of Europe's most complex karst networks. For decades, it has attracted explorers from across Britain, drawn by the mystery of passages that seem to have no end. In 1967, it became the backdrop for a quiet but haunting connection between two sets of young men, two cave systems, and two tragedies that marked an entire generation of British cavers. That spring, a team from the University of Leeds Speleological Association arrived in Northern Ireland to help map a newly discovered section of the Marble Arch system known as Screen Hill 3. It was one of several active dig sites feeding into the larger network. Tight, muddy, and difficult, but promising new routes linking underground rivers that had never been fully traced. The team included John Ogden, Geoffrey Vickers, and Colin Vickers, three skilled student cavers in their early 20s. They had spent much of the previous year exploring caves across the Yorkshire Dales and the Mendips, where they earned a reputation for their methodical style and endurance. The Marble Arch expedition was part of a long-term collaboration between the Leeds team and the local Fermanagh Caving Club. The goal was to push beyond the known chambers of Screenhill 3 into deeper sections that might connect with the nearby Noons Hole and Cascade systems, a link that, if proven, would have been one of the most important discoveries in British speleology at the time. The work was demanding. Long crawls through tight, dripping passages, wading through waist-deep mud, and chiselling through calcite barriers with hammers and crowbars. But for the Leeds group, this was the kind of exploration they lived for. The mix of science, endurance, and the quiet thrill of being the first humans to step into untouched space. During that 1967 campaign, Ogden, Vickers, and their teammates made significant progress in pushing the cave frontiers. They surveyed new extensions and carefully documented them, giving nicknames to each chamber and passage, a traditional practice in cave exploration. Among those names were Frakes Passage, Ogden's Rift, and Vickers Chamber, a modest nod to the men who had done the hard work of discovery. Their names were recorded in the expedition log and later added to the British Cave Research Association's maps. At the time, no one imagined that within a few months those same names would take on an entirely different meaning. By early summer, the Leeds team had returned to England and resumed their regular weekend trips into the Yorkshire Dales, where a number of new caves were being explored. One of these was Mosdale Caverns, a sprawling and notoriously wet system near Grassington. It was considered one of the most challenging caves in the country, a maze of low crawls, fast-flowing water, and unpredictable flood behaviour. Despite its reputation, it was the kind of cave that drew experienced explorers eager to test themselves. On June 24, 1967, 6 members of the Leeds University Club entered Mossdale to continue a survey. Among them were John Ogden, Geoffrey Vickers, and Colin Vickers, the same men who had spent the spring working in Screenhill 3. It was meant to be another weekend trip. Instead, it became the deadliest accident in British caving history. Heavy rain fell that afternoon, turning the surface streams into torrents. Inside Mossdale, the narrow passages of the marathon crawls filled with water in minutes. The 6 men were trapped deep inside. Despite a massive rescue operation involving hundreds of volunteers, none of them survived. Their bodies were never recovered. The authorities sealed the lower passages permanently, turning Mossdale into both a grave and a warning. When news of the Mossdale tragedy reached Northern Ireland, it sent a quiet shock through the Marble Arch community. The men whose names had just been written onto the Screenhill survey maps were now gone. Local cavers who had worked beside them only weeks earlier spoke of disbelief. The newly named features, Frakes Passage, Ogden's Rift, Vickers Chamber, suddenly read like memorials rather than discoveries. For the caving world, this connection between Screenhill 3 and Mosdale Caverns became an enduring symbol of how small and intertwined their community really was. The same generation of students who had pushed the limits of exploration across Britain and Ireland had now paid the highest price for it. After the Mossdale incident, the work at Screenhill 3 paused for a time. The Fermanagh teams continued limited surveying, but the momentum had shifted. When the official Marble Arch maps were later updated by the British Geological Survey, the names of Ogden and the Vickers brothers remained, marked in pencil at the edge of the system, the only record of their work underground. In the months that followed, discussions within the British Cave Research Association and the cave diving group turned increasingly towards safety. Mossdale had already triggered a national review of caving practices, but the ripple extended across the Irish border too. Cavers in Fermanagh began introducing new surface watch protocols, ensuring that any underground team had a person monitoring weather and communication above ground. For the first time, cave rescue coordination between regions was formally organised, linking Ireland and England through a network of contact officers. At Marble Arch, the explorers who returned in later years to continue mapping Screenhill 3 did so under much stricter conditions. They installed permanent guidelines, improved drainage at the surface entrance, and established emergency air pockets in long crawl sections. These were small changes, but they reflected a new attitude, one built on the memory of the Leeds team who had come before. Even today, the names remain on the survey charts used by the Marble Arch Caves Global Geopark. visitors walking the show cave above would never know that, deep below, side passages carry the names of men who once knelt in the same mud, measuring, sketching and talking quietly about the systems they hoped to connect. The handwriting in the original logbook still exists in the archives of the Ulster Museum, faded and smudged by damp. Next to Frake's passage, the note reads simply, "Surveyed May 1967, Ogden, G. Vickers, C. Vickers." Those small pencil marks would outlast their authors. And as the map spread across the British caving community, the link between Marble Arch and Mossdale became part of its shared mythology. Two distant cave systems, tied not by rock or river, but by the same young explorers who pushed too far, too fast, and left their names carved into the underground world they loved. Jacob's Well, Texas, USA. In the heart of the Texas Hill Country near the town of Wimberley, a round blue opening sits in the middle of Cypress Creek, perfectly still, like an eye staring up from the limestone. Locals call it Jacob's Well, and for generations it's been both a source of wonder and fear. On the surface it looks harmless, even inviting. A small natural spring about 4 meters wide, its water clear enough to see the rock walls dropping straight down. But beneath that calm opening lies a vertical shaft leading to one of the most dangerous underwater cave systems in the United States, a place that has taken more lives than any other Texas spring. Jacob's Well is part of the Edwards Aquifer, a vast system of underground rivers that feeds the surrounding region. The main vent drops about 30 feet before opening into a series of tight, twisting tunnels, 4 main chambers connected by narrow restrictions that are often smaller than a diver's shoulders. The water is crystal clear but cold, and silt from the soft limestone floor can turn the visibility to zero with one careless kick. For trained cave divers, it's an alluring but technical system. For the untrained, it's a trap. In the early 20th century, the spring was simply a swimming hole for locals and travellers, a place to cool off during the brutal Texas summers. People dove from the surrounding rocks, testing how deep they could reach before pressure or darkness forced them back up. Over the decades, stories spread of those who never resurfaced. By the 1960s, Jacob's Well had developed a reputation as both a natural wonder and a place of unexplained drownings. The first documented fatalities came from divers attempting to explore the lower chambers without proper training or equipment. The visibility and apparent simplicity of the opening deceived them. Many believed it was a straight vertical tunnel when in fact it branched downward into side passages. The first chamber leads to the second through a restriction barely 2 feet wide, a sloping funnel of limestone. From there, the route continues to the third and fourth chambers, where the ceiling narrows and the walls press inward. It's at these points that most accidents occurred. In 1979, 2 young divers from San Marcos entered the system with basic scuba gear. They descended through the first chamber easily, reaching the restriction into the second. Once inside, their bubbles stirred up a cloud of silt that erased all light. Disoriented, one diver panicked and kicked free his mouthpiece. The other tried to help but was caught by the same disorienting current. Neither survived. Their bodies were recovered several days later by trained cave divers from the Austin area who described the passages as tight, winding and unforgiving. The tragedy didn't stop others from trying. Throughout the 1980s, Jacob's Well became a challenge for local divers testing themselves against its depth and complexity. A few succeeded in reaching the final chamber, an airless cavity nearly 140 feet down, but many did not. The Hayes County Sheriff's Department recorded multiple recoveries over the decade, each involving divers who underestimated the system. One of the most infamous incidents occurred in 1983, when 2 young men entered the well after hours with rented scuba tanks. Neither had formal cave diving training. Witnesses reported seeing their flashlights flicker beneath the surface before going out entirely. When rescuers arrived, they found the entrance blocked by floating debris and silt, the water so cloudy that visibility was only a few inches. Recovery divers located the bodies wedged in a side passage, one trapped by his tank, the other caught in a dead-end fissure. Both had used up their air fighting to find their way back. The dangers were so well known by the late 1980s that signs were placed around the spring, warning visitors, "Do not dive beyond this point, many have died here." But even those words, etched in metal and bolted to the rocks, didn't stop thrill seekers. In 1997, another diver lost his life trying to reach the fourth chamber. According to rescue records, he became trapped in a restriction barely large enough for a body to pass through. Recovery took days. The operation was led by Texas State University's underwater research team, who'd been mapping the cave for hydrological studies. They described how one false move could turn a clear tunnel into a blind, chaotic maze, visibility vanishing with a single flick of a fin. By then, Jacob's Well had claimed at least 9 confirmed lives, possibly more, as early accidents were poorly documented. Each recovery required the help of trained cave divers, working in some of the most difficult conditions in the United States. The combination of cold water, narrow passages, and unpredictable flow made it unlike any other site in Texas. In the years that followed, the tragedies sparked a change in how authorities managed the spring. The Wimberley Valley Watershed Association, which oversees the site today, began restricting diving to scientific and certified cave diving purposes only. The general public was limited to swimming in the open pool, with barriers preventing access to the underwater entrance. Still, the legend of Jacob's Well continued to attract attention, both for its beauty and its danger. Hydrologists studying the system found that Jacob's Well behaves like a breathing organism. The flow of water reverses seasonally. In the dry months it exhales air and water upward, and in wet months it inhales, pulling debris and silt deeper into the aquifer. That shifting flow pattern can alter currents inside the cave, creating suction strong enough to disorient even experienced divers. It also means that conditions can change dramatically within hours, turning a safe dive into a lethal one. Training organisations such as the National Speleological Society Cave Diving Section, NSSCDS, later used Jacob's Well as a case study in their safety programs. They emphasised 3 recurring themes found in nearly every fatality there: lack of formal cave certification, failure to use a continuous guideline, and underestimating the effect of silt-outs in tight passages. Posters and videos produced in the 2000s for new divers included footage from Jacob's Well as an example of how fast conditions can collapse inside a spring cave. Despite all the warnings, the stories never stopped. Locals still talk about the way the water pulls, about swimmers who dive too deep chasing coins or cameras and come up gasping. On quiet mornings, when the sunlight pierces the water, you can see the entrance clearly, a perfect circle of blue, beautiful and still. But even then, the darkness below looks endless. In recent years, environmental scientists have focused on preserving Jacob's Well as an ecological site rather than a recreational one. The surrounding watershed supports rare species of amphibians and maintains groundwater for the nearby Blanco River. Diving is now strictly limited to research under controlled conditions, with redundant lines, decompression staging and remote monitoring. Yet the memory of the accidents lingers in every safety briefing. Locals keep count of the deaths, at least 12 since the 1960s, and every generation grows up hearing the same story, that Jacob's Well is deeper, colder, and more deceptive than it looks. It's a place where curiosity and caution meet, where the surface and the void are only a few feet apart. The spring still breathes as it always has, inhaling and exhaling through the limestone, its currents moving quietly through the underground network that no one has ever fully mapped. And somewhere in the cool silence beneath the Texas sun, the narrow tunnels of Jacob's Well remain exactly as they were, waiting in the dark. The Shaft, Mount Gambier, Australia, 1973. In the far southeast of South Australia, near the quiet city of Mount Gambier, the ground looks ordinary, flat pasture land dotted with gum trees. But beneath the grass lies a world of flooded limestone caverns, formed by thousands of years of rainwater dissolving the rock. The area is full of deep sinkholes known locally as blue holes, named for their striking colour and deceptive calm. One of them, a circular opening on a farmer's land, was called simply the Shaft. It was small at the surface, barely wide enough for a man to pass through, but below it expanded into a vast underwater chamber with crystal clear water. For divers in the early 1970s, it was irresistible. At the time, Australia's cave diving community was still in its infancy. The equipment was basic: single-tank setups, no redundant air supplies, and little formal training specific to caves. Most divers came from the open water world of reefs and shipwrecks. Caving techniques, guidelines, gas management, team discipline were still being borrowed from Europe and the US. In early 1973, a group of 12 recreational divers from South Australia organised a weekend trip to explore the shaft. None of them could have imagined that it would end as one of the country's worst diving tragedies. The opening to the shaft was hidden in a field behind a wire fence, surrounded by limestone rubble. The entrance looked harmless, a dark circle no more than a metre across. Divers had to descend by rope, lowering themselves through a vertical tunnel about 20 feet deep before reaching the water surface below. Beneath that, the cave opened into a chamber roughly 25 metres wide, filled with clear, cold water and columns of limestone stretching downward into darkness. It was beautiful and dangerous. On May 28, 1973, the team gathered at the site early in the morning. Among them were young divers, some with fewer than 50 dives of experience, along with a few who had visited the shaft before. They brought standard scuba gear, aluminum tanks, depth gauges and handheld torches. No one carried safety lines. At the time, the idea of laying a continuous guideline through a cave was not yet standard in Australia. The first group descended without incident, entering the main chamber and exploring near the ceiling, about 15 metres below the surface. The water was perfectly clear, visibility exceeding 30 metres. The second group followed, moving deeper into the chamber where the floor sloped downward into a tunnel. As the divers descended, their bubbles dislodged fine silt from the ceiling. Within minutes, the crystal water turned milky, visibility dropped to nothing. At some point, one diver lost sight of the exit shaft. A black hole above that now blended into the cloud of silt. Others tried to signal with flashlights, but the light bounced off suspended particles, creating a blinding white haze. Panic spread quickly. Several divers attempted to ascend simultaneously, colliding with one another in the narrow passage leading upward. In the confusion, regulators were kicked loose and equipment tangled. Those who made it out later described hearing muffled screams through the water, the sound of air escaping from regulators as divers struggled below. The silt storm was so thick that even the surface team looking down from the entry hole could see nothing. When the chaos finally subsided, 8 divers surfaced. 4 did not. Rescue divers from the local police and fire services were called, but the operation faced immediate challenges. The narrow entry shaft made it impossible for more than one diver to descend at a time. The water temperature was just above freezing and visibility was still near zero. After several hours, police suspended the initial recovery attempt until experienced cave divers from across South Australia could arrive. Over the following 2 days, a specialised team led by Captain John Sumner and other divers from the Royal Australian Navy's clearance unit arrived to assist. They used weighted descent lines, powerful lamps and communication tethers to guide them through the silted chamber. It took them hours to reach the bodies, which were found near the floor of the main chamber, entangled in each other's hoses and equipment. The position suggested they had lost orientation and air within minutes of the silt out. The tragedy shocked Australia. The news spread quickly through newspapers and radio, with headlines describing the shaft as a death trap. Public outrage grew, and the state government temporarily banned diving at all known sinkholes in the Mount Gambier region until safety investigations could be completed. The coroner's inquest, held later that year, painted a grim picture of inexperience, lack of training and inadequate procedures. It found that none of the victims had formal cave diving instruction and that the group had not established a dive plan or safety leader. There were no guidelines, no surface attendants trained for emergencies, and no redundancy in breathing systems. The coroner described the event as a preventable disaster, emphasising that the divers had entered an environment for which they were unprepared. The inquest findings led directly to a movement within the diving community to create formal standards for overhead environment diving. Later that same year, the Cave Divers Association of Australia, CDAA, was formed, led by Dr. Harry Baum, John Riley and other pioneers who recognised that without organisation, more tragedies would follow. The CDAA's founding principles were simple but transformative: formal training, graded certification and controlled access. In the years following the accident, every known sinkhole and underwater cave in the Mount Gambier region, including the Shaft, Picaninny Ponds and Engelbrecht Cave, was surveyed, documented and assigned access levels based on depth and complexity. Only divers certified by the CDAA were permitted entry, and every site required a permit system managed by local authorities. The new system drastically reduced fatalities and became a model for cave diving governance worldwide. For locals, the shaft became both a warning and a memorial. Farmers fenced the site and the CDAA erected a plaque listing the names of the 4 who died: Stephen Black, Michael Wilson, John Bogle and John Hodge. Their deaths marked the end of Australia's unregulated cave diving era and the beginning of professional safety standards. Even today, the water inside the shaft remains clear and still. Modern divers who visit under CDAA supervision descend along secured lines, equipped with redundant air systems and powerful lights, following strict depth limits. They enter knowing exactly what lies below. Not just the beauty of the chamber, but the history written there. When the sunlight hits the entrance just right, a single beam of light cuts through the shaft, illuminating the water in brilliant shades of blue. For a few minutes each day, the scene looks almost sacred. The same place where 4 divers half a century ago vanished into the dark and where an entire nation's diving culture changed because of it. Kilsby Sinkhole, South Australia, 2010. In the open farmland south of Mount Gambier, surrounded by fields of grazing cattle and limestone fences, there is a deep, circular hole in the earth that looks almost ordinary from a distance. Locals know it as the Kilsby Sinkhole, and divers call it one of the clearest bodies of water in the world. A vertical shaft plunging more than 60 metres straight down into the ancient limestone, its walls glowing turquoise when the sunlight strikes just right. But beneath its beauty lies a stark truth familiar to generations of Australian divers. Kilsby's perfect clarity hides an unforgiving depth. The sinkhole sits on private property, part of the Kilsby family farm, and for decades it has been both a training ground and a testing site. The water's visibility, often exceeding 100 feet, makes it ideal for underwater photography, film production and specialised training. In the 1970s, it was even used by the Royal Australian Navy clearance diving team for deep water exercises and sonar calibration. The military constructed platforms, installed ropes, and used it to simulate extreme descent conditions. When the Navy left, the site became one of the most famous recreational diving locations in Australia, managed under strict permits and training requirements by the Cave Divers Association of Australia, CDAA. But in May of 2010, the same calm water that drew divers from around the world became the setting for another fatal reminder that no amount of training can eliminate risk, only reduce it. That morning, a small group of divers arrived at Kilsby Sinkhole for what was supposed to be a controlled training session. They were experienced, part of an organised group under the CDAA's guidelines. The conditions were nearly perfect: mild temperature, no wind and glass-like water. Their plan was straightforward: to practice buoyancy control, depth management and emergency procedures. It was the kind of session held dozens of times each year, but something went wrong. Among the team was a 43-year-old diver from Victoria, described by friends as meticulous and safety conscious. He had logged many dives, including previous visits to Kilsby. According to witnesses, he began his descent normally, moving along the main vertical drop with his training partner. At around 30 metres, they paused to check gauges and adjust buoyancy. Then they continued deeper, reaching approximately 50 metres. Moments later, the diver signalled difficulty. His breathing rate increased. The other diver tried to assist, but within seconds the man became unresponsive. He was brought to the surface as quickly as possible, but resuscitation efforts failed. Emergency services from Mount Gambier responded within minutes, but it was too late. The diver was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause, later determined by the coroner, was drowning associated with equipment malfunction and rapid onset panic at depth, a sequence that can overwhelm even skilled divers. The incident sent a ripple through the Australian diving community. Kilsby Sinkhole was considered one of the safest sites in the country, with established emergency plans, controlled access, and highly experienced staff. Yet this death showed how easily a small equipment problem, combined with the psychological effects of depth, could escalate beyond recovery. When investigators from SafeWork SA and the South Australia Police Water Operations Unit reviewed the dive, they found that the diver's primary regulator, the device delivering air, had likely free-flowed, causing excessive gas loss. In deep water, that kind of malfunction demands calm, precise response. Switch to a backup regulator, control ascent and avoid overexertion. But even a few seconds of disorientation can turn deadly when nitrogen narcosis, a narcotic effect caused by breathing compressed air at depth, dulls judgment and slows reflexes. Witnesses recalled that he appeared to hesitate when switching regulators, perhaps uncertain which one was still functioning correctly. The partner assisting him later told investigators that he had tried to stabilise both their buoyancy, but was forced to surface when he ran low on air himself. The incident lasted less than 2 minutes. The Cave Divers Association of Australia, which oversaw the site's training protocols, launched its own internal review. It emphasised that while Kilsby was classified as a sinkhole site, distinct from the more hazardous cave site rating, the same principles of redundancy, buddy contact and dive planning applied. The death became a case study in how routine dives could turn critical without immediate practiced responses. For local residents, the tragedy was especially painful because of Kilsby's long history with both exploration and safety advocacy. The sinkhole had already played a major role in Australia's diving reform nearly 4 decades earlier, after a series of accidents in nearby caves like the Shaft and Engelbrecht Cave led to the foundation of the CDAA in 1973. Those early tragedies had shaped every aspect of training and certification in the country. To lose a diver at Kilsby in 2010 under supervised conditions felt like history echoing back. The coroner's report, released the following year, recommended enhanced equipment inspection protocols for training dives, mandatory pre-dive redundancy checks, and clear emergency ascent procedures even in shallow drills. It also urged divers to treat Kilsby, despite its reputation as a safe site, as an environment that demands the same respect as a deep cave. Since then, the CDAA and site owners have implemented additional measures: redundant safety lines along descent routes, oxygen stations at the surface, and real-time depth tracking for instructors during training. Only certified divers with current medical clearance can access the site. The sinkhole also now serves as a base for research into diver physiology, partnering with universities to study stress, panic response, and gas management under depth pressure. The tragedy, though, remains part of the site's story, one of many reminders that water clarity and familiarity can be deceptive. In interviews after the event, veteran cave diver Dr. Ian Lewis, one of the pioneers of Australian cave diving, reflected that Kilsby had always been as beautiful as it is unforgiving. He noted that its visibility gives divers a false sense of safety. In clear water, depth feels shallower and time seems to slow. But the body, he said, doesn't know what the eyes see, it only knows the pressure. For locals, the sinkhole's calm surface hides its history. Decades of exploration, training and tragedy coexist in its silence. On clear mornings, when the sunlight hits the limestone walls, the interior glows a deep cobalt blue, lighting up the suspended dust in slow motion. From above, the shaft looks like a window to another world, a perfect mirror framed by white stone. Yet every diver who steps to its edge knows that beyond that reflection lies a space where mistakes have no margin, where even the best prepared teams must face the limits of human control. The water remains so clear that divers can see their reflections 60 feet below, the ripples from their own fins shimmering back at them. It's the same clarity that once helped the Navy test sonar, the same clarity that drew filmmakers and photographers, and the same clarity that continues to draw divers from around the world. But inside that still blue column, every breath is earned, every move calculated, and every descent a reminder of what happened there in 2010, when one diver entered, trained, and never came back up. Jasinia Wilkasna, Poland. 2019, high in the Polish Tatra Mountains, where jagged peaks cut through the mist and the air smells of wet stone, lies a vast underground labyrinth known as Jasinia Wilkasna, the Great Snow Cave. Stretching for more than 24 kilometers through the limestone beneath Mount Malolacniak, it's the deepest and longest cave system in Poland, a cold, winding network of narrow shafts, underground rivers, and vertical drops that can take days to traverse. It has drawn generations of Polish cavers since its discovery in the 1950s, offering both exploration and danger in equal measure. In August 2019, that danger became painfully real when 2 members of a 6-person caving team became trapped deep inside the system after a sudden flood and rock collapse sealed their passage. What followed would become one of the most difficult rescue operations in Polish history. a fight against time, water and unstable rock that stretched for more than a week and captured the attention of the entire country. The group entered the Wilkasna system on August 15th, through one of its upper entrances near the Malolatsniak Ridge. Their goal was to explore a section known as Zimny Korytarz, or Cold Corridor, one of the deeper branches linking multiple cave systems. The plan was ambitious but routine for experienced Polish cavers. The Tatra's caving community is among the most skilled in Europe, known for their precision and endurance in extreme conditions. The first part of the expedition went smoothly. They navigated vertical drops, crawled through tight squeezes, and descended along fixed ropes. Temperatures underground hovered around 4 degrees Celsius, and water dripped constantly from the limestone walls. Then, deep in the systems, around 500 meters from the surface, the team encountered heavy water flow in a narrow section. It had rained on the surface for several days, and in caves like Wilkasna, rainwater seeps rapidly into the system, turning trickles into torrents within hours. At some point late that afternoon, a rockfall occurred near one of the narrowest sections. The collapse blocked the main passage behind 2 of the cavers, cutting them off from the rest of the team. The others immediately realized what had happened and began trying to dig through, but the debris was compacted and water was rising fast. They made the difficult decision to retreat and alert rescuers. By evening, a call went out to the TOPR, the Tatra Volunteer Search and Rescue Organization, Poland's elite mountain rescue service. Within hours, more than 30 rescuers began mobilizing at the cave entrance. They brought drills, compressors, oxygen cylinders, and rock-cutting tools. The operation was led by veteran caver Marek Malinowski, who'd overseen rescues in the Tatras before. But this one, he said, was unlike any other. The challenge was immediate. The blockage was located hundreds of meters inside a twisting tunnel less than 40 centimeters wide in places. Accessing it required crawling through water-filled constrictions for hours, dragging heavy equipment through shafts so tight rescuers had to remove their helmets to squeeze through. Every move had to be coordinated carefully, because even the vibration from drilling risked triggering further collapses. Meanwhile, the 2 trapped cavers were believed to be alive. The rescuers managed to establish partial audio contact, faint tapping or shouting through the rock, suggesting at least one was still responsive during the early hours of the operation. Hope remained high, but the rescue teams faced worsening conditions. The cold water continued to rise, and the passages became unstable. Several rescuers reported fresh rock movements and cracking sounds during their shifts underground. For the first 3 days, progress was painfully slow. Teams took turns working in 12-hour rotations, cutting through debris with pneumatic drills, using pumps to reduce water levels, and laying air hoses to maintain oxygen flow in the tunnels. The effort was physically punishing. The temperature never rose above freezing, and most rescuers worked lying in water, unable to stand or move freely. By August 18th, after more than 60 hours of digging, they reached the first blocked chamber, only to discover another collapse beyond it. The cave seemed to be closing in on itself. Hydrologists monitoring the flow warned that more rain on the surface could flood the section completely. The mountain was alive, one rescuer said later, breathing, shifting, pressing down. As days passed, engineers and military specialists joined the operation. They used endoscopic cameras and microphones inserted through narrow drill holes to search for signs of life. The signals, however, faded. Carbon dioxide levels inside the blocked sections were dangerously high, and the air temperature had dropped further. By August 20th, the rescue effort had grown to more than 100 people, including mountain medics, geologists, and volunteer cavers from across Poland and Slovakia. They worked around the clock, hauling pumps and compressors through vertical shafts. Above ground, tents and floodlights turned the normally quiet valley into a 24-hour base camp. The families of the trapped men waited nearby, receiving regular briefings from the rescue coordinators. Inside, the rescuers had reached a point less than 10 meters from where they believed the men were located. They could see fragments of rope, personal gear, and signs of recent movement. But beyond that, another layer of rock had sealed the passage completely. The drilling equipment could not reach safely without risking further collapse. The vibrations alone were destabilizing the ceiling. At one point, a secondary fall nearly trapped 3 rescuers working in the tunnel, forcing a temporary halt. As the days turned into a week, the mood at the surface shifted from determination to grim acceptance. The topper leadership held out hope, but acknowledged the reality. The conditions made survival increasingly unlikely. By August 23rd, after 8 days underground, the decision was made to suspend the main drilling operation and switch to recovery rather than rescue. It took several more days before they finally reached the chamber. The two bodies were found side by side, still connected to their ropes, in a small cavity beyond the final collapse. The position suggested they had tried to retreat before the water and debris overtook them. The cold, oxygen-poor environment likely claimed them within hours of the initial rockfall. The bodies were recovered on August 24th, 9 days after the operation began. When the rescuers emerged from the cave carrying the stretchers wrapped in waterproof tarps, hundreds of people, family members, journalists and local residents, stood in silence along the forest path. The operation had lasted more than 500 hours, involving over 300 participants from across the country. Afterward, the Polish caving community conducted a thorough review. Investigators from the Polish Mountaineering Association concluded that the accident had been caused by a combination of factors: a sudden increase in water flow due to heavy rainfall, the fragile nature of the limestone, and the inherent difficulty of the tight passages in that section. The cavers had followed procedure and carried proper gear, but the cave itself had turned against them. In the aftermath, Polish authorities introduced new safety measures for complex cave expeditions in the Tatras, requiring weather assessments, backup communication devices, and surface monitoring for rainfall. The Wielka Śnieżna rescue became a case study in both the courage and the limits of underground operations, a reminder of how, in the Tatra Mountains, the line between exploration and disaster can shift in an instant. Even now, cavers who pass through the entrance at Malolatniak pause before descending. The air there is colder, the echo sharper. The tunnel leads down into the same passages, the same rock that collapsed that summer. And deep within, the sound of dripping water still marks the place where two explorers were trapped, waiting in the dark while the mountain above them continued to move. Porthia Ogof School Party Cases, Wales, UK. In the Brecon Beacons of South Wales, where the River Melter cuts through dark limestone hills, there is a cave whose entrance looks like the mouth of a sleeping giant. Locals call it Porthia Ogof, the gateway of the cave. For centuries it has been a place of curiosity and fear. The entrance arches wide and low, stretching nearly 20 metres across, where the river disappears into darkness. On summer days it's surrounded by hikers and students on school trips, but below that calm water, a labyrinth of submerged tunnels has claimed more lives than any other cave in the United Kingdom. Unlike the deep vertical shafts of Yorkshire or the underwater chambers of Mendip, Porthia Ogof lies almost flat, a horizontal river cave that seems approachable. The passageways are broad, the ceilings smooth and worn by centuries of rushing water. Yet it's that very water that makes it deadly. The Melty's flow changes in minutes with rainfall, turning from a trickle into a torrent capable of sweeping away even experienced cavers. The cave has been mapped to over 1 kilometre in length, with 12 entrances leading into interconnecting chambers, sumps and constricted air pockets known as ducts. Its final exit, known grimly as the exit pool, has been the site of repeated tragedy. The first recorded death there dates back to the 1940s, but it was during the 1970s and 1980s that Porthia Ogof gained its reputation as a dangerous place. Adventure centres and schools across Wales had begun including outdoor activities in their curriculums, hiking, climbing and caving, as part of new educational programmes. Porthia Ogof, being easily accessible and visually impressive, became a favourite choice for instructors leading groups of teenagers. In 1971, a school party from England visited the cave during a residential course. The group, led by 2 instructors, entered through the main arch, following the river's path inside. The students were excited. They had helmets, lamps and waterproof clothing, but most had never been in a cave before. At first, the route was easy, wide chambers and shallow pools. As they moved deeper, the light from the entrance faded, replaced by the beam of their torches bouncing off the water. Near the resurgence pool, the instructor led them along a ledge where the stream narrowed and deepened. A few students decided to wade across. The water was faster than it looked. Within seconds, one of the boys slipped, his foot caught in a crevice. The current pulled him under, sweeping him toward the exit pool, a deep submerged passage with almost no visibility. His classmates tried to reach him, but the force of the water was too strong. By the time rescuers arrived, the boy had drowned. His body was recovered later that day by local cave divers, who described the underwater route as disorienting and black as ink. The tragedy triggered an immediate investigation by local authorities. It revealed that the instructors had not checked rainfall data and that the cave's water level had risen several inches in the hours before the accident. Still, outdoor education was growing, and Porth Ogof continued to attract groups every year. Then, in 1976, another fatal accident occurred, this time involving 2 students from a youth adventure program. The pair were exploring the lower passages near the Trident series, a complex of tunnels named for their 3 branching routes. The water suddenly surged after heavy rain, cutting them off from the main party. Despite a major rescue involving dozens of volunteers, both drowned before they could be reached. The rescue leader described the scene as a maze that fills with water like a drain. By the early 1980s, Porth Ogof's name had become synonymous with caving danger in the UK press. Each incident followed a similar pattern: small groups, inexperienced participants, and sudden water rises. Yet because the cave was accessible and technically classified as horizontal, it was not considered beyond the ability of guided youth groups. Adventure instructors often underestimated its hydrology, unaware that rain from distant valleys could reach the system hours later, raising the water level with no warning. The most publicised tragedy came in 1984, when a school group from England's Midlands region entered the cave on a routine field trip. The party consisted of 9 students, aged between 14 and 16, and 2 instructors. The conditions at the entrance were calm and there was no visible danger. The plan was to explore the main route and exit near the bridge cavern, a short distance away. Somewhere near the halfway point, the river began to swell. The guides called for a retreat, but one section of the group became separated. As they attempted to cross a submerged ledge, a surge of cold water from the surface forced several of the students off balance. 2 were swept away and disappeared into the exit pool. Divers from the South Wales Cave Rescue Team arrived within hours, assisted by police and fire crews. The recovery took 2 days. Both students were found entangled in branches and debris in an underwater pocket less than 5 metres from the main passage. The event made national news and prompted a parliamentary review into outdoor education safety. In the years that followed, the Health and Safety Executive, HSE, and British Caving Association introduced stricter regulations for organised caving trips. Schools were required to verify instructors' qualifications and to file route plans before entering any cave system. Weather checks, emergency lighting, and surface spotters became mandatory. Porth Ogof, in particular, was designated a controlled site. Warning signs were installed near every entrance, including one that remains today at the main arch, readings "Danger, many have died here, no unauthorised entry." Despite these measures, accidents continued sporadically into the 1990s and early 2000s, often involving individuals rather than school groups. In 1991, a local caver drowned attempting to freedive the exit pool, the same section that had claimed so many lives before. The incident reinforced what decades of experience had already shown, that even a few seconds of misjudgment could be fatal in fast-moving water. Modern rescue teams still use Porth Ogof for training, precisely because it represents a mix of hazards: unpredictable flow, confined spaces, and low visibility. Every rescue scenario in Wales now incorporates lessons learned there: the need for clear supervision ratios, surface monitoring, and communication between instructors and emergency services. The cave's tragedies helped shape national standards for outdoor adventure safety across the UK. Today, on a quiet day in the Brecon Beacons, Porth Ogof looks peaceful again. The water flows smoothly under the limestone arch, and children play on the rocks nearby, unaware of the history beneath their feet. But in the caving community, the name still carries weight. Inside, the walls are polished smooth from centuries of floods, and the air feels heavy. The same river still running silently toward the black pool where light vanishes, the place that has taken so many before: Gouffre Berger, Lake Cadou, and Deep Camps, France. In the limestone heart of the Vercors Plateau in southeastern France, surrounded by pine forests and mountain pastures, a narrow crack in the earth descends into one of the most legendary and unforgiving cave systems on the planet, the Gouffre Berger. For cavers, this name has the weight of Everest. When first explored in 1956, it became the first cave in the world known to reach a depth of more than 1,000 metres. But beyond its record-breaking numbers, the Berger is remembered for something else: the way it tests human endurance against the raw, unpredictable power of the underground. From the entrance, the cave drops quickly. The air is cold, damp, and smells of stone and metal, a series of vertical pits. The Puits Aldo, Puits Ruiz, and Puits Garbi lead explorers deeper and deeper through slick shafts and waterfalls. Each section requires ropes, anchors, and precise rigging. The sound of water grows louder the farther down you go, until it becomes constant, a low roar echoing through the darkness. At about 250 metres, the passage levels out into wide galleries before plunging again, through cascades and narrow meanders. Eventually, around 700 metres, explorers reach Lake Cadou, a large underground pool named after the French caver Pierre Cadou, who drowned there in 1967 after sudden flooding cut off his route to the surface. His death was one of several that turned the Berger from a triumph of exploration into a cautionary tale. The conditions that took his life are part of what make the Berger so dangerous. Its drainage system connects directly to the surface through fissures that react instantly to rain or melting snow. What begins as a trickle at the bottom of the cave can turn into a violent torrent within hours. In the 1960s and 1970s, before reliable weather forecasts and radio communication underground, this meant that any expedition risked being trapped by rising water. In 1967, Cadou and his team from Lyon were part of a major expedition to push the cave's limits beyond 1,000 metres. They had established multiple underground camps stocked with food, sleeping bags, and carbide lamps. The system's exploration required days of descent and ascent, each camp acting as a checkpoint where teams could rest before continuing downward. Cadou was part of a small team stationed near Lake Cadou, preparing to ferry equipment through the flooded section. That night, heavy rain hit the surface. Within hours, the calm pool turned into a raging siphon. The rising water trapped Cadou and his companions beyond the narrow tunnel that led back toward a higher ground. Two of them managed to escape through an emergency bypass, but Cadou, struggling with equipment, was caught in the surge. His body was recovered days later when the water finally receded. The lake has carried his name ever since, a permanent reminder carved into the cave's maps. Over the decades that followed, the Berger saw countless expeditions, scientific, sporting, and rescue-oriented. Each required meticulous logistics, rope systems spanning hundreds of meters, underground bivouacs stocked with oxygen cylinders and emergency rations, and communication lines that could stretch for kilometers. Teams had to plan their movement in sync with weather forecasts, surface support, and exhaustion cycles. Even small mistakes could cascade into crisis. In 1996, nearly 3 decades after Cadou's death, another major flood struck deep within the Berger. A British expedition, working near the 900-metre level, was suddenly forced to retreat when the water began rising at an alarming rate. The rescue became one of the largest underground operations in French history, involving dozens of cavers and local firefighters. Fortunately, everyone survived, but several were trapped for more than 24 hours, waiting in near-freezing water for the flow to subside. The incident reinforced the cave's unpredictable nature. Even with modern gear and experience, the Berger could still change without warning. Those who have spent nights in its deep camps describe an environment that feels almost alive. The temperature hovers around 4 degrees Celsius. Every sound is amplified. The dripping of water, the creak of ropes, the wind-like sighs that echo through the galleries. In the lower sections, explorers sleep on raised platforms above pools of water, wrapped in damp thermal blankets. Even with modern lighting, the darkness feels absolute. Hypothermia is a constant threat. In 2012, another near tragedy underscored the risks of prolonged exposure. A caver suffered acute hypothermia after being caught in a flooded section near Lake Cadou. His teammates stabilized him with emergency blankets and warm fluids until rescuers could reach them, an operation that took nearly 10 hours. The man survived, but the incident highlighted how quickly fatigue, cold, and water could turn lethal, even with proper preparation. The Berger's structure itself amplifies these dangers. Unlike caves with a single predictable river path, it is a maze of vertical drops and crossflows. During storms, Water doesn't just rise from below, it falls from every side. Passages that were dry during descent can become waterfalls during ascent. Teams often have to rig alternate routes using high traverses to avoid newly flooded shafts. Rescues in such conditions are some of the hardest in the world. Despite this, the cave remains a magnet for cavers worldwide. Each summer, international expeditions return to remeasure, photograph, and study its geology and biology. They plan months in advance, with weather monitoring stations, satellite communications, and strict surface coordination. Yet even with all this, they know that once they're below 500 metres, the mountain has the final say. Veteran French speleologist Jean-François Pernet, who has led multiple expeditions into the Berger, once described the experience of reaching the bottom as stepping into the lungs of the earth. At the lowest point, more than 1,100 metres down, there is an underground river. Cold, fast, and perfectly black. To get there, teams must pass through Lake Cadou, crawl through flooded meanders, and descend a final shaft known as the Grand Canyon. It takes most cavers 3 days to reach the bottom and 2 days to return. The logistics are staggering. Every piece of equipment, ropes, fuel, food, stoves, must be lowered and hauled back up manually. When something goes wrong, evacuation takes days, not hours. In 2018, during a training expedition, a caver suffered a broken leg near Camp 2 at 500 metres. The rescue required more than 200 people working in shifts, using pulley systems and stretcher hoists. It lasted 56 hours. Even then, the operation was considered a success because the man survived. At Lake Cadou, the water still hides the scars of past floods. Divers have measured the chamber's depth and mapped its siphons, but parts of it remain inaccessible. The sediment carries small fragments of rope, carabiners, and old carbide tins, remnants of early expeditions. The nameplates left by Cadou's team, handwritten in paint, still cling to the rock above the waterline. Modern expeditions to the Berger now follow a strict protocol. Entry is only permitted during periods of stable weather, and surface teams track rainfall across the entire plateau. Underground camps are stocked with dry suits, emergency heating packs, and radio relays. Yet every veteran who descends the shafts knows that all these precautions exist because of what the cave has done before. To Cadou in 1967, to the trapped British teams in 1996, and to countless others who learned in the dark that the Berger decides who leaves. The Gouffre Berger remains one of the most magnificent and dangerous places ever explored by humans. The rock walls echo with the sound of running water, sometimes distant, sometimes near. At Lake Cadou, the reflections are perfect, still, cold and silent, until the next storm rolls over the Vercors Plateau and the mountain breathes again. Mossdale Memorial Enclosure, UK. On the open moorland west of Grassington, the wind moves endlessly over the peat, a restless, whispering sound across miles of empty hills. To most walkers, it looks like any other part of the Yorkshire Dales, rolling ground, heather, the distant shapes of dry stone walls. But beneath this quiet landscape lies a labyrinth carved by water, a cave system so narrow, so unpredictable, that it changed the history of British caving forever. Its name is Mosdale Caverns. On the surface, there's almost nothing to see. A shallow shake hole marks the entrance, a dark slit in the limestone where a small stream disappears underground. For years after June 1967, that stream carried with it the memory of 6 young men who entered and never came out. Their deaths, John Ogden, Geoffrey Vickers, Colin Vickers, William Frakes, Michael Ryan and David Adamson, remain the worst tragedy in the history of British caving. The rescue effort that followed had been monumental. Hundreds of volunteers from across the country gathered on the moor, battling rain, exhaustion and rising floodwater. They dug trenches, diverted streams and worked in 12-hour shifts trying to reach the men trapped deep in a passage known as the Marathon Crawls. But the weather did not relent. Water poured into the system faster than pumps could remove it. After 3 days of searching, the decision was made to stop. The lower sections of the cave were sealed by order of the local coroner, making Mossdale the first cave in Britain closed by official decree. For decades, that closure defined everything about the site. The entrances were bolted shut, the approach fenced, and access prohibited. It was not simply an administrative decision. It was a recognition that Mossdale was unpredictable, impossible to secure, and in the words of one rescuer, a place that keeps what it takes. The families of the 6 men, devastated and exhausted by the ordeal, faced an agonizing choice. The bodies of their sons lay in a section of cave that rescuers deemed too dangerous to reopen. The floodwaters had filled every passage. Engineers and geologists advised that further digging could destabilize the system and risk more lives. The families agreed that the dead should remain where they had fallen. A few months later, when the flood levels dropped, a small team of cavers returned under police supervision to carry out a final inspection. They reached a dry section known as Assembly Hall, where personal equipment had been found, ropes, carbide lamps and notes. In a short but solemn act, they sealed the deeper crawl permanently, placing a small memorial plaque within the chamber. It was, effectively, an underground reinterment. From that day, Mossdale became less a cave and more a memorial. On the surface, a simple cairn of stones was built on the moor directly above the point where the men had last been known to be alive. It bears a bronze plate engraved with their names and the date, June 24th, 1967. Visitors who find it often leave small tokens, coins, helmet lights or scraps of rope. There is no road, no path, no signpost. Reaching it requires a walk across open moor, where the wind erases every trace of the trail within hours. For years, few spoke of Mossdale. The Leeds University Speleological Association, to which all 6 belonged, quietly withdrew from active caving for a time. Many of their surviving members left the sport altogether. Those who remained used their grief to campaign for reform. The tragedy forced the British Cave Research Association and the British Cave Rescue Council to standardise procedures across the country, creating surface control systems, weather monitoring and formalised rescue training. The phrase Mossdale rules became shorthand in caving circles for risk thresholds that should never be crossed. In the 1970s, official maps of the Dales still showed Mosdale Caverns, but marked them as closed. The ban on exploration remained absolute. Yet cavers are drawn to such places the way mountaineers are drawn to unclimbed peaks. Rumours circulated of people entering in secret, a handful of experienced explorers quietly visiting the upper dry sections during droughts. Most kept their visits private, out of respect for the families and for the unwritten rule that Mossdale was not to be disturbed. Through the 1980s and 1990s, a new generation of British cavers grew up knowing Mossdale's story not as a location, but as a lesson. Training manuals cited it as the defining case study in hydrological awareness, how rainfall miles away can reach underground systems within hours, how crawls can flood in minutes, and how the promise of discovery can turn fatal. For safety instructors, it became the turning point that separated exploration from risk. In the early 2000s, with better mapping and technology, small authorised visits to the entrance chambers were allowed under strict supervision for geological study. The deeper flooded section, however, remains sealed to this day. Its lower passages, where the 6 died, are considered permanently off-limits. Each summer, cavers gathering in the Dales for the British Cave Research Association conference still make the quiet walk to the cairn. The ceremony is informal, a reading of names, a moment of silence, and the placing of new stones. Many who attend never met the men, but every British caver knows them. The spot is marked on no tourist guide, yet it is visited more often than many official memorials. The surface of the moor above Mossdale hasn't changed much since 1967. The same stream that swallowed the men still disappears into the same slit in the limestone. In dry months, it's only a trickle. After rain, it becomes a roar. On overcast days, the wind sweeps the heather flat, and the only sound is water moving somewhere beneath the earth. Those who have stood at the entrance say it's an unnerving place, silent except for the faint echo of the stream. The metal grate installed decades ago to block access is now rusted and half buried in moss. A few feet away, the ground dips into a hollow known as Mossdale Scar, a jagged wall of pale rock that hints at the labyrinth below. There are no flowers, no benches, no trace of ceremony, only the cairn on the ridge above, weathered by 50 years of rain and wind. The memory of Mossdale also lives in the data collected since. Hydrologists have measured how quickly rainfall affects the cave's flood patterns, confirming what rescuers learned the hard way. Within just 2 hours of heavy rain, the lower crawls can flood completely, filling with cold, oxygen-poor water. The speed and unpredictability of that process explain why no recovery was ever attempted again. For the families, the moor remains both grave and shrine. Many returned in later years to scatter ashes of relatives near the cairn. Others avoided it entirely, preferring to remember the men from photographs and old expedition logs. The Plura Cave Museum holds some of their gear, helmets, notebooks, and the original survey maps drawn by hand on graph paper. The items are displayed behind glass, faded but intact. The names at the bottom of the charts, Ogden, Vickers, Frakes, match those engraved on the memorial above the moor. When the light fades in the dales and the last hikers head home, the moor grows silent again. Beneath it, the Mossdale stream still runs through the flooded marathon crawls, down into the hidden chambers where the men were last seen alive. The rock has long since sealed the way, and the water flows past their resting place, cold and unchanging. Above, the cairn stands against the wind, a small pile of stones marking where adventure met its limit. The earth keeps its secrets quietly. Every tunnel, every flooded chamber carries the memory of those who entered and vanished in the dark. Above ground, time moves on, but below the caves remain, cold, silent, and waiting.